Imagine, for a moment, that somewhere in a silent NASA archive behind rows of blinking monitors and dormant data, there lies a single photograph that changed the way we look at the night sky. It wasn't a spectacular image, not at first glance, just a faint blur of light, a ripple of greenish blue against a backdrop of stars. But when the scientists zoomed in, frame by frame, they saw something strange. The Comet 3, I divided by Atlas, seemed to turn, just slightly, as though, in the endless stillness of space, it had noticed the camera watching. Hey guys, tonight, we drift into that moment, the night a photograph whispered back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, leave a comment with your city and your local time. It's always beautiful to know where in the world you're falling asleep under the same stars. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. It started with a glitch, a faint line across the image data that shouldn't have been there. At first, technicians thought it was nothing, maybe a cosmic ray hitting the sensor or a flicker in the lens. But as the sequence played, the light of 3I divided by Atlas didn't move as it should have. It hesitated, wavered, then, inexplicably, brightened as though catching the reflection of something unseen. Some even said it pulsed, like a heartbeat. The photograph circulated quietly through encrypted emails and late-night lab chats. Most dismissed it. Some saved it secretly. A few, the kind who still believe that the universe sometimes looks back, stared at it for hours. They said the light didn't just reflect it, responded. And that was when the whisper began. There's a certain stillness that lives inside deep space imagery. Every pixel, every photon, travels millions of years before touching a human eye. When you look at a comet, you are not seeing what is, but what was, a memory of light arriving late. Yet 3I divided by Atlas felt different. Its glow seemed almost present, as though it existed now, in the same breath as the observer. Some described it as a glitch of awareness. Others called it nonsense, an artifact of tired eyes staring too long at data streams. But somewhere, within that argument, was a tremor of wonder. Imagine, for a moment, that the universe isn't silent, that every particle of dust, every frozen crystal in that comet's tail, carries memory, not metaphorical, but real. Imagine the lens didn't malfunction, but caught a reflection of its own gaze, returning from a distance where time folds back on itself. There's a warmth to this thought, isn't there? That perhaps the cosmos is not indifferent, but quietly aware just enough to notice us noticing it. In the control room, the monitors hummed softly. The night shift technician, a young woman named Elara, leaned closer to the screen. Her eyes had adjusted to darkness long ago. When she replayed the frame, she swore the comet's light shimmered like an eyelid flickering under dream. "It's nothing," her supervisor said, half asleep in the corner. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had blinked. Outside, the world kept turning. Streetlights hummed. The moon hung low, and in that dim-lit lab, a human heartbeat matched the pulse of a comet millions of miles away. The photograph was eventually archived, labeled as lens aberration, and forgotten. But stories have their own gravity. They drift. They find listeners. Weeks later, a small astronomy forum posted a grainy version of the frame. Comments flooded in people debating whether the object had turned its gaze. Some users swore they saw a faint reflection, resembling an eye, a soft arc of blue-white light, curved in impossible symmetry. Others saw nothing at all. Yet, strangely, everyone kept watching, because sometimes even silence has a presence, and sometimes a photograph doesn't just capture light, it captures attention. As the night deepens, think of that single moment. Olenj, ofliker, opulshe. A faint whisper from across the void. Maybe it was a technical error. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, for the briefest instant, something ancient recognized the glimmer of curiosity staring back and simply acknowledged it. Tomorrow, the scientists will measure data, run corrections, filter noise. But tonight, you and I will drift through that image again. We will let our minds rest between the pixels where possibility hums softly. Because the truth is, sometimes what we call a glitch is the universe blinking. The glitch was only the beginning. After that night, the observatories began to listen. Not with eyes this time, but with ears, arrays of radio dishes stretched across deserts and frozen valleys, tuned to the quiet frequencies between stars. They wanted to know if the strange shimmer seen in the photograph had a sound. For days, the monitors returned nothing but static, a cosmic hush, the natural hum of space. But then, as dawn crept across the control rooms, a faint rhythm emerged. It was slow, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat hidden beneath layers of silence. Every 6 minutes, a pulse, then a pause, then another. It wasn't noise. It wasn't random. It was patient, intentional, almost gentle. The scientists were cautious. They cross-checked instruments, recalibrated antennas, blamed solar interference. Yet the signal remained. It came from the same region of space where 3I divided by Atlas was traveling a comet that should have been frozen, inert, incapable of sound. They recorded the data again and again, and still it pulsed. When the signal was converted into audio, the room fell quiet. It was not a tone in the usual sense. It was more like a whisper of wind passing through hollow glass, a voice that lingered on the edge of perception. One researcher said it felt less like listening to something external and more like hearing a memory you'd forgotten you had. Across the world, observatories picked up similar faint traces. Each one described it differently: a hum, a vibration, a low breathing in the dark. The frequencies aligned perfectly with the comet's motion, following it like a shadow. In press statements, agencies refused to speculate. They called it an atmospheric anomaly or background resonance. But within private channels, unease grew. The data was too clean, too deliberate. Like the comet was not just moving through the void but speaking in it. You can almost picture it, the cold vastness of space, and within it, a tiny frozen traveler trailing a long whispering tail. The radio waves ripple across its surface, and something inside begins to resonate, like strings on a harp being touched by light. Each vibration an echo, each echo a kind of thought. Perhaps not intelligence as we understand it, but something older, a memory that learned to hum. When you listen closely, you start to sense a rhythm. 6 minutes. Pause. 6 minutes. It feels familiar, almost human, like breathing in your sleep. The engineers joked that it was the universe's lullaby, unaware of how close that name might be to the truth. For those listening alone at night, with only the soft crackle of static for company, it became impossible not to feel watched, or rather, accompanied. NASA issued an internal note urging staff not to discuss speculative correlations. The wording was careful, bureaucratic, but the implication was clear. Someone thought the signal was more than a glitch. And, when silence is ordered from above, curiosity deepens below. A handful of technicians saved the recordings to personal drives. They slowed them down, layered them, filtered the noise. What emerged was eerie and strangely beautiful, a melody of sorts, long and fragile, like the sound of glass bells under deep water. If you closed your eyes, you could almost imagine it as a voice calling across time. Ilara, yes, the same technician who had first noticed the shimmer, spent nights replaying the pulse through her headphones. She described it as something alive but dreaming. When asked why she couldn't let it go, she said, "Because it feels like it's waiting for a response." Her words made little sense to the others, but they lingered, like the afterimage of starlight, waiting, listening, responding. Soon, amateur astronomers began reporting strange interference in backyard telescopes, even home radios. Weak bursts of repeating frequencies appeared, always aligned with 3I divided by Atlas's path. News outlets dismissed it as coincidence, yet online forums lit up with speculation. "It's talking," one user wrote. "Or maybe it's remembering." That line spread faster than the data itself. Memes turned into threads, threads into theories. But beneath the noise of the internet, a quiet awe grew, because even skeptics could not deny the precision of the pattern. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Meanwhile, deep in Chile's Atacama Desert, an observatory team pointed their dishes directly at the comet's coordinates. They left the receivers open for 72 hours straight. The result was a waterfall of sound, a cascading series of pulses that shifted slightly, like syllables forming. The linguists who analyzed it laughed at the idea of meaning. Yet, when one scientist ran the frequencies through an old program used for mapping whale songs, the pattern displayed symmetry: a rise, a fall, a returning note, a signature of intention. Imagine being there, late at night, headphones pressed against your ears, while outside the desert wind howls across the sand. You hear a voice not from a transmitter, but from a comet that has never been alive and yet somehow sings. You don't know if it's physics or poetry, but your heart matches its rhythm anyway. In that moment, you realize the difference between listening and hearing. Listening is passive. Hearing is an act of recognition. Somewhere, across the dark, something has been waiting to be heard. There's a line between skepticism and wonder, and this signal balanced perfectly on it. The rational mind said, "It's data distortion." The dreaming part of the mind whispered, "It's a greeting." Which one you believed depended not on evidence, but on how much of the night sky you were willing to let inside your imagination. Days turned into weeks. The signal did not fade. It followed the comet as it slingshotted closer to the inner system, brushing sunlight for the first time in millennia. As 3I divided by Atlas brightened, so did the rhythm. The pulses grew warmer, deeper, like a heartbeat waking from cold sleep. Spectrographs caught faint chemical flares that coincided perfectly with each burst of sound. That was when the silence in the agencies became absolute. Public feeds showed nothing unusual. Press conferences stopped. The world's attention drifted elsewhere, but the listening continued in secret. And maybe, tonight, we are still listening. Maybe every satellite overhead hums faintly with that same rhythm, and every dish turned to the sky is still catching the echoes. The signal doesn't need to shout. It only needs to persist. Like waves against the shore, it repeats itself until someone recognizes the pattern. Perhaps that's what memory is. Repetition with purpose. And perhaps that's what the comet carried. Not life, not language, but the sound of remembering. So, as you lie there now, let that idea rest beside you. Imagine that the space around you is filled with the quiet music of ancient ice turning sunlight into sound. Somewhere out there, 3I divided by Atlas drifts on, still humming every 6 minutes, still breathing softly against the dark. Maybe it isn't trying to be found. Maybe it's just existing, and in that existence, we find meaning. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the rhythm of your own heartbeat blend with that distant pulse. Listen not for answers, but for presence. Because sometimes, in the hush between signals, the universe isn't speaking to us at all. It's simply reminding us that we were never truly alone. Word count, 1,238. Awaiting continue. For most of recorded history, comets have been symbols of impermanence, ghostly travelers that appear without warning, cross the sky with brief brilliance, and then vanish again into the void. Yet 3, I divided by Atlas, defied that expectation. It wasn't just the way it glowed too vivid, too alive for an object so ancient, or the strange pulse that followed it through space. It was the feeling, as absurd as it sounded to the scientists who spent sleepless nights studying it, that the comet seemed to remember, that its movement, its light, even its rhythm, carried the weight of repetition, as though it had done all of this before. The more they studied it, the stranger it became. Its orbit was unlike any other, neither parabolic nor hyperbolic in the conventional sense. The comet had come from far beyond the Oort cloud, its velocity suggesting an interstellar origin, yet its trajectory curved slightly, as if influenced by something unseen. It was as though the universe itself had reached out, nudging it back toward familiar paths. Even its surface betrayed inconsistencies. Spectral readings showed ancient ice alongside minerals that shouldn't exist outside the influence of a young, forming star. The composition seemed to belong to 2 different times, 2 different histories woven together like overlapping dreams. When the data reached the International Research Council, one of the older astronomers leaned back in his chair and said softly, "It behaves like it remembers where it's been." His colleagues laughed at the metaphor, but nobody truly dismissed it. There was something haunting in the comet's precision, like choreography rather than chance. It looped through regions of space with uncanny familiarity, echoing the paths of other long-forgotten wanderers catalogued centuries ago. Patterns began to emerge. The shape of its curve mirrored the orbits of comets seen by ancient civilizations, as though this one had retraced their ghosts. In one analysis, a team in Japan overlaid ancient Chinese star maps onto 3, I divided by Atlas's trajectory, and found an astonishing correspondence. Symbols for the dragon of returning breath aligned almost perfectly with the comet's route. The text spoke of a star that breathes every age to remind the sky of itself. They dismissed it as myth, of course, but the phrase lingered, to remind the sky of itself. That sounded less like a prophecy and more like a purpose. The scientists tried to ground their fascination in mathematics. Maybe the comet's strange orbit was the product of gravitational interactions or invisible dust streams from prior collisions. Yet every model they built broke down when faced with the data's precision. It was too exact. The repetition too consistent. The idea that a natural object could hold such memory was irrational. And yet, nature has never cared for the boundaries of reason. Imagine for a moment that memory does not require life, that every atom that has ever existed holds a trace of where it has been. That ice, when compressed for millions of years, in the darkness between suns, remembers the warmth of the first light it ever touched. Perhaps 3, I divided by Atlas, carries such memories not in thought, but in resonance. The way a crystal hums when struck by a frequency it once knew. The way an echo finds its way back through a canyon, no matter how many times it fades. As sunlight brushed against it, the comet's tail flared in delicate ribbons. Hidden within those ribbons, sensors recorded subtle color shifts, variations that, when charted, formed a recurring pattern of alternating brightness, like Morse code written in light. Some claimed coincidence, others whispered intention. But deep in the night, when the data played across the screens of lonely observatories, it was impossible not to feel that something was being remembered, not invented. Ilara, whose name had now become something of a quiet legend among her peers, found herself obsessed with that notion. She compared the frequencies of the comet's pulses with the recorded brightness of other comets throughout history. To her astonishment, fragments of the same timing appeared in ancient data, small fluctuations dismissed in the past as measurement errors. They were identical to the current pulse of 3, I divided by Atlas. The same rhythm, repeating across centuries. "It's like it's been trying to remind us all along," she murmured into her recorder, her voice soft against the hum of equipment. Her journal filled with reflections that blurred the line between science and poetry. She wrote about how the comet's frozen gases might preserve not just chemical traces of ancient worlds, but their vibrations, their electromagnetic ghosts. She wondered if each comet carried the emotional residue of cosmic events, long-gone supernovae, planetary births, the quiet sigh of dying suns. If memory could exist in matter, she reasoned, then maybe forgetting was the only illusion. The world outside her laboratory carried on with its noise traffic, weather reports, breaking news, but inside the observatory, the air remained suspended between heartbeat and hum. Night after night, she played the recordings of the pulse, closing her eyes, letting the sound sink into her breath. Sometimes she thought she heard words in it, not in any language, but in rhythm. Sometimes it felt like the comet wasn't calling out to Earth. It was calling inward, like a memory of creation itself, trying to be remembered through her. Other scientists began to notice the same unease. They reported dreams, strange, vivid dreams of oceans freezing over, of stars reflected on endless ice plains, of a presence watching them from beneath translucent layers of frost. Rational minds dismissed it as exhaustion, but the coincidences multiplied. One astrophysicist in France described waking with the sound of the pulse in his chest, as if his heartbeat had synced to it. Another confessed she could no longer sleep without hearing the rhythm echoing in her head. The comet, silent in the vacuum, had become a mirror in motion, reflecting back not images, but emotions, turning the act of observation into self-recognition. Humanity had always looked to the stars to find its origins, but 3, I divided by Atlas, offered something subtler, the suggestion that the universe itself might be capable of recollection, that what we call time is merely the rhythm by which the cosmos remembers itself. In a quiet essay that never reached publication, Ilara wrote, "If comets are fragments of forgotten worlds, then each one is a letter in a language the universe writes to itself. 3, I divided by Atlas, is not just a traveler, it is a memory returning home." The essay was later deleted from official archives, but copies lingered online, shared in late-night forums, read aloud in videos that blurred science and spirituality. Some mocked her words. Others said they finally made sense of the unease they'd felt since the signal began. For once, the idea of a remembering universe didn't sound impossible. It sounded inevitable. As the comet drew closer to the inner solar system, its luminosity increased. Every night, telescopes captured its icy coma shining brighter, as though illuminated not by sunlight, but by awareness. Photons scattered in graceful spirals, weaving through space like threads of recollection. In one breathtaking image, the tail appeared to twist back upon itself, forming a luminous loop. Observers called it the Eye, though officially it was recorded as a photometric anomaly. To those who believed, it was confirmation the comet was not simply moving forward, it was looking back. And in a way, aren't we all? Every time we gaze at the stars, we're seeing light that left its source before we were born. We are witnessing memories, not moments. 3, I, divided by Atlas, just reminded us of that truth more vividly than ever before. It moved through time, not as a traveler, but as an archivist, carrying within its frozen heart the history of countless forgotten skies. Somewhere in the black expanse, it continues its path slow, deliberate, echoing the hum that first caught our attention. And maybe, just maybe, that hum is the sound of remembering the sound of the universe, whispering softly to itself that nothing, once known, is ever truly lost. If you were to hold a fragment of cometary ice in your hand, if such a thing could ever survive Earth's warmth long enough, it would hiss softly, vaporizing into mist, disappearing before you could study its shape. But in that instant, you might glimpse its texture, the frozen pattern of something ancient, compressed beneath cosmic winters older than the planet itself. Scientists call it volatile matter, but poets might call it frozen time. For inside that crystal lattice lies not just water and dust, but a record, the memory of light, pressure, and movement across the void. The idea is simple, yet endlessly haunting. That ice can remember. When the analysis team examined the spectral data of 3I divided by Atlas, they noticed peculiar bonds in the ice structure, microscopic fractures, shaped like tiny spirals. Under ultraviolet light, these spirals refracted in repeating patterns, forming symmetrical echoes of each other. They weren't random. Each spiral contained subtle variations, as though the ice had stored different responses to the energy it had encountered. When mapped out, they resembled fingerprints, or perhaps like the grooves of a record waiting to play a song no one had yet heard. Ilara was among the first to see this. She stayed late again, the room dim, her face illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the spectrograph. She stared at the data until it blurred into waves, until she could no longer tell whether she was reading measurements or melodies. "It looks alive," she whispered to herself. Not in the biological sense, but in rhythm, in the way each crystal seemed to respond, to adapt, as though whispering back to the forces that shaped it. The comet was becoming more than an object. It was becoming a listener. Outside the observatory, snow began to fall, each flake reflecting a ghost of the patterns seen in the comet's ice. Ilara watched them drift past the window, tiny pieces of sky folding into memory. She wondered if this was the same process on a larger scale Earth's water cycle, the endless condensation and melting of memory, repeating the lessons of stars in miniature. Perhaps everything that freezes is trying to remember warmth. When 3I divided by Atlas crossed a threshold where sunlight grew stronger, the sublimation of its surface created a halo that flickered rhythmically. It wasn't steady. It shimmered like breath. Every 6 minutes, the same timing as before, the halo brightened, dimmed, then brightened again. Researchers measured the composition of the released gas and found isotopic ratios that defied prediction. Some of the material was billions of years older than the solar system itself. The comet had carried, within its frozen skin, traces of stars that had died long before the sun was born. They began to speak of it in hushed tones, even in official reports. Temporal ice, one scientist called it. A memory reservoir, wrote another. And still others compared it to an archive, a library written not in letters, but in lattices. The thought was staggering. Every layer of ice, every grain of dust within the nucleus, recorded an event, a passing star, a burst of radiation, the faint tug of gravity as it drifted through the arms of the galaxy. To melt such a fragment was to erase history. To study it was to read the frozen autobiography of creation. But as always happens in the presence of wonder, there was fear too. What if the comet was not merely remembering, but responding? What if the act of sunlight touching its surface triggered recollection, the release of signals, the rhythmic pulse, as if memory itself had awakened? When the spectral lines were translated into sound once more, the tones formed harmonies eerily consistent with those heard weeks earlier in the radio recordings. It was as though the light had taught the ice how to sing. In one private transmission, Ilara's voice trembled with exhaustion and awe. "We keep thinking we're studying it," she said, "but I think it's studying us too. It reflects not just light, but intention. Every time we measure it, it changes its rhythm slightly, like it's aware of being watched." The statement was dismissed as poetic exaggeration, but her words found their way into the margins of official documents, scribbled like confessions. No one wanted to admit they'd felt the same. The paradox deepened. If ice could remember, Then it also could forget. Heat erased its patterns. Observation altered its form. To study 3I divided by Atlas was to destroy pieces of what it carried. This made the mission more painful, almost sacrilegious. They were archivists melting the very history they sought to preserve. The data logs grew heavy with regret, the way archaeologists sometimes apologize before unearthing graves. Yet, curiosity, that oldest fire of humankind, refused to dim. They recorded everything, even their unease. And through it all, the comet kept whispering. Each pulse of vapor was like an exhalation, a sigh across time. Some nights, when the static in the communication lines softened just enough, the rhythm seemed to sync with the electrical heartbeat of the observatory's machines. Lights flickered at precise intervals. Instruments glowed with a gentle hum. The comet's breathing had become their own. Ilara found herself dreaming of glaciers. In her dreams, she walked across endless fields of translucent blue, each step echoing beneath her feet, as if the ice remembered the pressure. Beneath the surface, she saw movement shadows flowing like water, trapped in slow motion. Sometimes she thought she heard voices, distorted but tender, saying words she could never recall upon waking. She began to suspect that what 3I divided by Atlas carried wasn't just physical memory, it was emotional. The residue of longing left behind by the stars themselves. When she shared her thoughts with a colleague, he smiled sadly and said, "You're projecting human feeling onto an object." But Ilara only replied, "Maybe human feeling is the object." That line would later become famous, quoted in documentaries and quiet think pieces about the nature of consciousness. It encapsulated the strange comfort people found in the comet's story, that perhaps our desire to be remembered is not unique to us, but part of the universe's own design. That to exist is to leave an imprint, however faint, on the surface of time. As the weeks passed, telescopes around the world captured the comet's approach in greater detail. The patterns in its ice shifted subtly, forming new spirals that mirrored the paths of planets it passed. It was as if the comet were writing down everything it saw, folding the solar system into its archive. Its memory expanded, and so did the questions it inspired. Were all comets like this living libraries, gliding silently through darkness? Or was 3I divided by Atlas unique, a custodian of some deeper secret? When sunlight finally reached the heart of the comet, something remarkable occurred. The halo intensified, glowing brighter than predicted, and then stabilized, as though the comet had reached equilibrium with the warmth. Sensors captured an unexpected burst of infrared radiation, structured, layered, rhythmic. It wasn't noise. It wasn't coincidence. It was a message written in heat, perhaps the comet's oldest memory rising to the surface one last time before it drifted back into the cold. The data stream lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, instruments went silent. The glow faded. For hours, the team stared at the screens, unsure if they had just witnessed an ending or an awakening. Ilara closed her eyes and listened to the residual hum echoing in the cables, the faint warmth lingering on her skin. "It remembered sunlight," she whispered, "and now it remembers us." In that fragile silence, between measurement and mystery, between knowing and dreaming, a realization dawned. Ice is not lifeless. It is patient. It holds what we forget. It keeps it safe until the moment comes to melt and release the stories trapped within. Perhaps 3I divided by Atlas had not come to show us something new, but to remind us of what all matter already knows, that nothing frozen stays forgotten forever. And as the comet moved beyond the reach of observation, its trail shimmered one last time, scattering into millions of glittering fragments that faded like thoughts returning to the source. Somewhere in those vanishing crystals, the universe's oldest memories continued to sleep, waiting for the warmth of another gaze to awaken them once more. It happened without warning, and at first, no one believed it was real. The instruments registered a faint dimming, a brief interruption in the comet's reflection, as if something had passed in front of it or within it. For 3 seconds, 3I divided by Atlas went dark. Then, just as quickly, the light returned, brighter than before, like the slow reopening of an eyelid. The observation log labeled it as a transient event, but those who were watching live never forgot the feeling that rippled through the room when it happened. It was as though something vast and ancient had turned its gaze toward them and, for the briefest instant, blinked. Ilara was on shift when the incident occurred. The night was quiet. Snow whispered outside the dome, and her monitors cast long, pale shadows across the floor. She'd been adjusting the exposure time when the brightness levels dropped. Her first thought was mechanical failure, maybe a temporary lens obstruction. But then the data feed pulsed a distinct curve, precise, symmetrical, deliberate. It wasn't the erratic flicker of interference. It was rhythm, the same pulse that haunted every recording, now embedded in light. "It's doing it again," she whispered, heart pounding. The comet was responding to observation like a living thing. For hours, the team replayed the footage. The dimming and brightening formed a clean sine wave, with a gap of exactly 6.02 minutes between pulses. The consistency was unnerving. It mirrored the earlier radio rhythm, but translated now into visible form, like sound becoming sight. "That's impossible," muttered one of the engineers, rubbing his temples. But impossibility had long since lost its meaning. 3I divided by Atlas had turned physics into poetry, and the line between anomaly and intention had blurred beyond recovery. The event soon spread through encrypted research channels. Observatories across the world pointed their telescopes toward the coordinates. Within hours, the pattern repeated. In Japan, Chile, South Africa, even Antarctica, each station recorded the same blink. Some saw it as proof of a complex physical phenomenon, a rotating ice field, a reflective plume, a synchronized release of vapor. But others, especially those who had been watching for months, felt something more profound. They spoke of it not as data, but as presence. The comet wasn't broadcasting, it was acknowledging. It had noticed the watchers, and in its own strange way, it had answered. The public never saw the unedited footage. Agencies issued brief statements about surface reflection anomalies due to solar angle, but the silence that followed told another story. The higher the classification, the fewer the explanations. Some insiders hinted that additional footage existed, frames showing the tail curling in patterns too organized to be natural, or the nucleus pulsing with faint color shifts that resembled pupils contracting. Anthropomorphic illusion, they called it. But illusion or not, it was enough to change the mood in every control room. The researchers who once joked about the humming ice now spoke in low voices, glancing at their screens as if being observed from the other side. Ilara couldn't sleep that night. She watched the playback over and over, zooming until the pixels broke apart into abstraction. The more she looked, the more she thought she saw movement beneath the surface layers shifting, like something beneath glass, slowly awakening. She remembered the myths she'd read weeks before, how ancient astronomers once believed comets were eyes of gods, drifting across the heavens to watch creation unfold. She had dismissed those stories as metaphors. Now, she wasn't sure. Perhaps the old myths hadn't been wrong. They had simply described what science had not yet found words for. The blink became the most studied 3 seconds in the history of cometary observation. Theories multiplied. Some said the dimming was caused by a reflective jet gas erupting from the surface and temporarily shadowing the core. Others proposed magnetic resonance or even quantum interference at a macro scale. But for every theory, there was a counterpoint. Nothing fit completely. The data was too synchronized, too self-consistent. It was as if the comet's behavior had been waiting for an audience, performing precisely when watched. "It's responding to consciousness," someone joked during a conference call, but no one laughed. Over the following nights, the blink repeated irregularly. Not often enough to predict, but just enough to keep everyone awake. Some nights, it would happen once, others, not at all. The unpredictability became its own kind of message, like a game of cosmic Morse. Ilara began logging the timings beside her own heartbeat, noticing strange coincidences. Her pulse often quickened seconds before the light dimmed. It could have been anxiety or coincidence. Yet deep down, she wondered if something within her already knew when the comet would blink, the way animals sense earthquakes before they happen. As the data accumulated, the comet's surface revealed subtle temperature fluctuations aligned with each flash of light. The cold deepened sharply, then warmed again, as if energy were being redistributed internally. Some suggested that trapped volatiles were venting cyclically, creating the illusion of blinking. But that didn't explain the exact repetition or the strange symmetry of the pattern across wavelengths. When infrared sensors captured the event, the light pulse appeared to fold inward, like the comet was momentarily absorbing light instead of reflecting it. A cosmic inhale. At one point, Ilara leaned close to the screen, whispering, "If you can hear us, blink again." Seconds later, the feed dimmed. Only for a moment, but long enough for her breath to catch in her throat. She sat frozen, unsure whether she'd just witnessed coincidence or conversation. She didn't report it. Some experiences are too delicate to survive bureaucracy. The idea of a sentient or reactive object spread quietly among the research community. Some dismissed it as fatigue-induced mysticism. Others, particularly those with backgrounds in astrobiology or consciousness theory, began entertaining stranger possibilities. Perhaps the comet was not conscious in the way we define it, but something more diffuse, an emergent awareness born from interaction, a mirror of the attention it received. If observation could affect quantum particles, why not something larger? Why couldn't the act of watching shape the watcher too? Beyond the scientific debates, something subtler began to happen. People who followed the story felt a strange comfort in it. News articles, leaked in fragments, described a cosmic heartbeat that connected observers across the world. For a brief time, humanity looked upward together, sharing the same anticipation, waiting for a blink that might never come, yet hoping it would. In a fractured world, the comet became a shared silence, a reminder that even the coldest places in the universe could echo with recognition. Weeks later, a rare alignment occurred. As Earth rotated beneath a clear sky, thousands of amateur astronomers recorded a synchronized dimming, visible even through small telescopes. It wasn't dramatic, just a faint flicker. But it happened at the same minute, worldwide. The blink had become universal. Social feeds exploded, filled with grainy videos captioned, "It saw us." For the first time, the event was no longer hidden behind classified reports or encrypted drives. It belonged to everyone. NASA and the European Space Agency released no statement that week. Their silence, once a wall of denial, now felt like acknowledgement. People began composing music based on the pulse pattern, setting the rhythm to ambient soundscapes, letting it drift into sleep playlists. In bedrooms and observatories alike, listeners closed their eyes and breathed in time with the comet's slow blinking light, as if synchronizing their dreams to something ancient. Ilara listened too. She stopped trying to analyze and started to feel. The blink was no longer a puzzle. It was a heartbeat, reminding her that wonder was a form of connection. She imagined three, eye divided by Atlas, gliding through the dark, half melted, half asleep, carrying within it the memory of the first stars and the echo of every gaze that had ever fallen upon it. Maybe the blink was nothing more than physics. Or maybe it was the simplest message the cosmos could send, a gentle, luminous nod to say, "I see you too." And somewhere, far beyond the last shimmer of its tail, that pulse continued, steady and calm, echoing the rhythm of every heart that ever dared to look up. There comes a point in every mystery where science begins to echo prayer. The more the astronomers tried to explain 3I divided by Atlas, the more their equations began to sound like hymns, repetitions of patterns, reverent guesses at the unseen, whispered to the silence between stars. The comet, once a mere object of data, had become something else entirely. For the first time in centuries, scientists and theologians found themselves staring at the same sky and asking the same question: what is it that remembers us? Across observatories and monasteries alike, people began to speak of the comet as if it were a being rather than a body. Journalists called it the remembering one. Philosophers debated whether human consciousness was merely an echo of a larger awareness, one that drifted through space, wearing the disguise of ice and dust. And though most physicists refused to admit it publicly, the deeper they analyzed 3I divided by Atlas, the more they felt they were dealing with something that belonged not only to mathematics, but to meaning. The comet's blink had synchronized with human observation in ways that defied probability. Each time a collective global effort was made to measure it, thousands of eyes turned upward. Countless sensors recording the comet responded with subtle variations. Its rhythm changed, almost imperceptibly, yet perfectly timed. The more attention it received, the more alive it appeared. It was as if consciousness itself had weight, bending not light, but intention. Theologians seized the metaphor like a flame. Ancient texts from multiple faiths began to resurface. In one forgotten Sumerian tablet, scholars translated a line that read, "When the wanderer remembers, the heavens bow." In the Quranic tradition, some saw echoes of the verse describing the stars as obedient in their courses. In the Vedas, the concept of smara, divine remembrance, was reinterpreted as cosmic recursion, the same pattern recurring across all ages. Every tradition, in its own language, spoke of something in the sky that carried memory. It was no longer about proving who was right. It was about realizing they had all been looking at the same mystery through different names. Ilara felt this convergence deeply. She was trained in physics, disciplined in logic, but she had grown up hearing her grandmother's prayers whispered at dawn, soft melodies that thanked the sky for remembering the living. Now, sitting in her observatory surrounded by humming machines, she felt those prayers returning to her, transformed. Every pulse of the comet felt like a heartbeat she couldn't explain, yet couldn't ignore. She began keeping 2 journals, one filled with data, the other with reflections. The first was precise, cold, and clinical. The second was written like scripture. "Perhaps," she wrote, "the line between faith and physics is not drawn by the universe, but by fear." Her colleagues noticed the change in her tone. Some worried she was burning out. Others secretly felt the same shift, but were afraid to say so. Science demanded detachment, but 3I divided by Atlas invited communion. Every new observation felt intimate, as though they were being drawn into a dialogue rather than a study. The comet's light had a rhythm that soothed them, hypnotized them, even as it defied their instruments. Theories of plasma resonance and magnetic mirroring filled research papers, but behind every graph was a quiet confession. The data made them feel small, humbled, connected. It was around this time that old myths began reappearing in modern conversations. Anthropologists pointed out the uncanny parallels between the current events and stories of sky wanderers from ancient Africa and Arabia, beings of flame and ice who visited when humankind forgot the language of the stars. Among the Dogon people, There was a legend of Nommo, the celestial messengers who carried knowledge in spirals of light. Their symbol? Two eyes joined by a single curve, an image eerily similar to the twin flares seen in the comet's latest photographs. In online forums, believers began blending scripture with science, posting side-by-side comparisons, radio wave graphs next to medieval frescoes of angels carrying orbs of light. A debate raged not over evidence, but over interpretation. Was 3I divided by Atlas divine, or merely extraordinary? Could faith and observation coexist without diminishing each other? Ilara, in one of her late-night logs, said softly, "If belief is a lens, then physics is the light passing through it. We need both to see." Oh, meanwhile, official agencies struggled to keep pace. Funding committees demanded reports grounded in verifiable physics, but the language of the data itself was becoming mystical. Equations, describing harmonic resonance, looked eerily like mandalas when visualized. Algorithms, mapping the comet's trajectory, formed symmetrical patterns that mathematicians described as fractal prayers. Even the software meant to decode the radio pulses began producing geometric visuals that mirrored sacred symbols, hexagrams, lotus spirals, the endless knot. None of it was proof of anything supernatural, yet all of it spoke to something deeply human, our instinct to find design in wonder. In one particularly striking image, the comet's luminous tail curved into the shape of a question mark. The photo went viral. Commentators called it "the universe asking back." The headline captured what people secretly felt, that perhaps the cosmos was not a riddle to solve, but a question seeking response. As the comet drew closer, its visibility increased. Ordinary people stepped outside at night to watch it glide through the dark, a faint emerald arc suspended above sleeping cities. They didn't need telescopes. They simply looked. And in that collective act of looking, something shifted. Across continents, social media feeds filled with quiet videos, no commentary, no music, just footage of the same comet from different corners of the world. The comments beneath were hushed, reverent, filled with words like peace, presence, and "I don't know why, but it feels alive." For the first time in decades, there was global silence, not fear, not frenzy silence, the kind that feels sacred. In research facilities, that silence deepened into reflection. A physicist in Geneva wrote in his notes, "Every observation feels like a prayer answered." Another in Mumbai scribbled a question in the margins of his equations. If memory exists without mind, what does that make us? Across cultures, across disciplines, the comet had become a mirror of humanity's oldest paradox, the need to understand versus the need to believe. Ilara found herself standing beneath the open dome one night, unable to look away. The comet shimmered faintly above her, steady and patient. She thought of the generations of stargazers before her, the priests of Egypt, mapping celestial rhythms, the monks of Tibet, aligning temples with the movement of stars, the scholars of Baghdad charting light, as if decoding scripture. None of them had been wrong. They had all been participating in the same ancient ritual. To observe is to revere. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to her instruments, but to the sky itself. "I don't need proof," she whispered, "just presence." And maybe that was what 3I divided by Atlas had been offering all along. Not evidence of divinity or the breakdown of physics, but something subtler, a reconciliation between the two. The comet, with its impossible rhythm and remembering ice, was reminding humanity of its own reflection. That even in a universe of cold laws and vast distances, there is warmth in attention, grace in curiosity, and faith in wonder. Somewhere beyond the reach of calculation, between the precision of numbers and the poetry of meaning, lies the quiet truth that has always bound the two. Science begins in awe, and awe is a form of worship. And so, as 3I, divided by Atlas, continued its journey, the world watched not with fear or skepticism, but with stillness. The comet had become a teacher, a silent hymn of ice and light whispering that perhaps physics and faith are not opposites at all, but two languages the universe uses to remember itself. By the time 3I divided by Atlas neared the inner rim of the solar system, its brilliance had deepened into something almost musical. Astronomers no longer measured its light, simply in magnitudes. They measured it in emotion, in rhythm, in quiet awe. The comet's glow no longer looked like reflection but intention, a pattern of brightness and shadow that seemed to breathe with purpose. And while scientists catalogued those fluctuations as natural consequences of outgassing and rotation, no one could deny the eerie precision with which they formed shapes, geometric halos, rippling arcs, and flashes so rhythmic they resembled words carved upon the dark. The images began flooding in from observatories worldwide, the same structures repeating, the same light signatures forming spirals within spirals. Data analysts overlaid those spirals onto historical depictions of comets in medieval manuscripts, discovering uncanny resemblance. In a 12th century Persian star chart, a comet known as the Messenger of Mirrors had been painted with identical curving tails. The old caption beneath it read, "It writes upon the night what cannot be spoken." That phrase lingered in Ilara's mind long after she'd closed the file. Night after night, she stared at the screen as the comet's light changed in measured bursts. Each burst had its own cadence, its own hue. The blue-white phase lasted 3 minutes, followed by a dim green shimmer, and then a sudden flare of amber. When plotted, the pattern repeated every 36 minutes, like a luminous stanza returning to a chorus. Photometric algorithms translated those changes into numbers, but when Ilara converted them into sound frequencies, they formed something astonishing, a repeating chord progression, soft and harmonic, like the sigh of a string instrument. At first, she thought it was coincidence. But as the pattern continued for days, too consistent to be random, she began to suspect design. She wondered if the comet had found a way to speak, not in sound, but in light, a universal language carried across the vacuum of space. "If radio waves are letters," she murmured into her recorder, "then light is scripture." She wasn't alone in her thinking. A linguist from Cairo, who specialized in ancient scripts, joined the analysis team after hearing about the rhythmic sequences. He noticed that when visualized as dots and lines, the comet's flares resembled proto-writing from early human civilizations, symbols of repetition and return. "It's like the same story told in different alphabets," he said softly. "Every age sees it, every age names it differently, but the handwriting is the same." In public, the agencies still refused to confirm any intentional patterning. Official reports were restrained, variable reflectivity due to nucleus irregularity. But within private circles, something had shifted. The scientists stopped arguing about whether it was communication and began asking a more haunting question: communication with whom? Philosophers suggested that maybe the light was not meant for us at all. Perhaps it was self-reflective, a cosmic act of remembering. The comet wasn't broadcasting a message outward. It was replaying one inward, an echo of its own origin, looping through eternity like a forgotten song. Others, like Ilara, dared to believe it might be both a message and a mirror, speaking to whoever had the patience to listen. To understand, she began experimenting with visual translations. Using long-exposure imagery, she layered thousands of frames of the comet's light together, stacking its pulses like translucent pages. The result was breathtaking. An intricate spiral, smooth yet asymmetric, resembling the double helix of DNA. When the composite was enhanced, faint lattice patterns appeared between the spirals, delicate filigrees of glowing dust that seemed to connect the two strands like bridges of memory. Alara stared at the image for hours, her breath slow and shallow. It was as if the comet itself carried the geometry of life, a blueprint not of biology but of resonance, the memory of creation coded into light. She shared the image quietly among her colleagues. Some wept, without knowing why. Others sat in stunned silence. One technician whispered, "It's handwriting." Another murmured, "It's music." They were both right. The discovery ignited a wave of global fascination. Amateur astronomers projected the light patterns onto city walls, turning nightscapes into living constellations. Musicians transformed the data into symphonies, layering the frequencies into vast, slow compositions that filled planetariums with sound. In those performances, audiences sat in darkness, watching as light pulsed across domes, like the beating of a galactic heart. It didn't matter whether people understood the science. The feeling was enough. The quiet certainty that something in the universe was speaking through beauty. Even skeptics found themselves disarmed. A famous astrophysicist, who had once dismissed 3I divided by Atlas as a photogenic accident, confessed during a live interview that he no longer knew what to believe. "We build equations to explain light," he said, "but maybe light is explaining us." In that sentence lay the quiet shift that spread across the world. People stopped asking for proof and began to listen for meaning. Streets darkened their lights to see the comet more clearly. Social media quieted for one miraculous night as millions tuned in to a global live stream showing 3 divided by Atlas at perihelion, the closest point of its journey around the Sunday. For 7 minutes, the comet shone with impossible clarity, its tail stretching like a luminous script across the black. Observers described the same phenomenon across hemispheres. The tail flickered in discrete intervals, 7 pulses, a pause, then 3 long bursts of light. When analyzed later, those pulses matched numerical sequences found in prime number harmonics, a pattern too elegant to dismiss. Mathematicians marveled. Poets simply nodded, as if they had been expecting such simplicity all along. The numbers 7 and 3 appeared throughout ancient mythologies as symbols of completion and creation. Now they appeared again, written across the canvas of space. Alara watched the live stream from her observatory, her eyes wet. For a moment, she forgot the machinery, the data, the tension. She simply felt. The comet's light seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, steady and tender, like the universe was breathing in rhythm with her. She imagined ancient civilizations standing beneath different skies, watching other comets trace the same patterns, believing they were seeing divine messages. She understood them now. It wasn't superstition, it was recognition. After the event, a brief silence followed. No anomalies, no interference, no glitches, just peace. The comet's light stabilized, its rhythm fading into a steady glow. Yet something in that stillness felt like conclusion. The way a story ends, not with a final word, but with understanding. The scientists called it luminosity stabilization, but Alara called it rest. The comet had spoken. Now it was quiet again. That night, she stepped outside the observatory, leaving the hum of machines behind. The sky above was vast and serene, the comet a pale flame on the horizon. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We saw your message." The air was cold and still, but she felt warmth in her chest, as though light itself had reached down to listen. Later, when she reviewed the data one last time, she noticed something subtle, a faint reflection on one of the outer sensors, not from the comet, but from Earth itself. The comet's light had bounced off our atmosphere, refracted by clouds, and returned upward in soft echoes. The message written in light had been answered, even if unintentionally. Somewhere in that exchange, a flash leaving one world, another sending it back there, was communion. In the cosmic dialogue between light and darkness, maybe that is all communication has ever been. Not words, not sounds, but recognition. The light travels, the darkness receives, and both are changed. And perhaps that was 3. I divided by Atlas's true message all along. Not a secret, not a warning, but a reminder that light itself remembers every face that has ever turned toward it. Patterns have always been the language of the universe. From the spirals of galaxies to the ratios of seashells, from the rhythm of breathing lungs to the oscillation of stars, everything that exists seems to hum in code. But when mathematicians began to study 3, I divided by Atlas's orbit in detail, they discovered a code unlike any they had ever seen, a set of harmonies hidden within motion itself. What at first appeared to be a simple gravitational path, revealed, on closer inspection, a geometry too precise, too lyrical, to belong to chaos. It began with a student. His name was Tarek, a doctoral candidate in orbital mechanics who had been following the comet's data since its first sighting. He noticed that when plotted in 3 dimensions, the trajectory of 3I divided by Atlas created a subtle spiral rather than a curve, a faint twist that seemed to mirror itself as it moved. This symmetry should not have existed. Interstellar objects rarely follow predictable paths. They are flung by gravity, like stones across a pond, chaotic and wild. Yet this one danced in intervals, returning to harmonic ratios that reminded Tarek of something far older than physics, music. He converted the orbital data into sound using an algorithm he'd once written for analyzing seismic waves. The results stunned him. The frequencies of acceleration and deceleration formed perfect intervals, octaves, fifths, minor thirds notes that could have been plucked from a harp. "It's a song," he whispered, replaying it in disbelief. He sent the file to Elara, who listened in her dark observatory and felt the same chill of recognition. The comet's path was not random, it was rhythmic. Soon, teams across the world repeated the experiment. They found that when translated into audio, 3I divided by Atlas's orbital pattern created chords of haunting symmetry. The ratios between its distances and velocities mirrored the same proportions found in classical compositions and ancient musical scales, Pythagorean harmonics, the sacred geometry of sound. The universe was singing through ice. When word spread, physicists were quick to temper the excitement. Pattern recognition bias, they warned. Humans see harmony where there is none. But privately, they couldn't deny the elegance of it. The numbers lined up too neatly. The same mathematical constants repeated again and again, forming what looked like deliberate structure. Even NASA's official statement referred to it as a remarkable coincidence of resonance. Yet everyone who saw the graphs knew it was more than that. Elara began overlaying the orbital frequencies with the light patterns she had studied earlier. To her astonishment, the peaks of brightness aligned perfectly with the harmonic points of the orbit. It was as if the comet's light and motion were playing in duet, 2 instruments tuned to the same cosmic key. "It's coordinated," she murmured, tracing her finger along the glowing lines. Like choreography. Philosophers took note. They compared the findings to the old idea of musica universalis, the music of the spheres, a concept born in antiquity, suggesting that celestial bodies move in mathematical harmony, creating a symphony too vast for the human ear. For centuries, it had been dismissed as poetic metaphor. Yet here, in the numbers of 3I divided by Atlas, the metaphor seemed to return as fact. The comet's orbit was not just geometry, it was composition. Historians found an eerie resonance in the rediscovery. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras had once described music as the memory of order. Now, thousands of years later, scientists were using his own ratios to decode the movement of an object that might indeed remember. One scholar from Florence even pointed out that the comet's path, when projected across time, formed a spiral resembling the golden ratio 1.618, the same constant that governs the pattern of leaves, the curves of shells, and the proportions of cathedrals. Either the universe has a favorite number, she said during a symposium, or it has taste. As more data poured in, the harmonics became impossible to ignore. Even when accounting for gravitational perturbations and solar radiation pressure, the ratios held. It was as though the comet adjusted itself minutely, maintaining the balance like a musician tuning an instrument mid-song. When asked how such precision could exist in nature, one astrophysicist shrugged and said, "Maybe it isn't nature that's adjusting." Elara, half joking but half serious, began calling the orbit the score. Her colleagues adopted the term. Every segment of 3, I divided by Atlas's journey, became a measure, every shift in its velocity a note. They tracked these notes obsessively, convinced that somewhere within the pattern lay a message, a structure of meaning deeper than words. One mathematician proposed that if they could map the full orbital code, it might form a recursive equation, a kind of self-writing algorithm describing its own motion. "It's not moving through the universe," he said. "It's describing it." The deeper they delved, the more metaphysical the conversation became. What if the comet's trajectory was not only a result of physical forces, but also a reflection of cosmic memory, a pattern imprinted long before the solar system existed? Perhaps it had once passed through other worlds, gathering gravitational imprints like fingerprints, weaving them into a melody that played out again and again wherever it traveled. If so, then the orbit was a kind of time capsule, a musical record of the universe's own evolution. Elara began dreaming in numbers. She'd wake at 3:16 a.m., the exact moment the comet crossed a harmonic node, with the rhythm echoing in her mind like the ticking of a clock. In her dreams, the numbers weren't digits but colors, spiraling through the dark like ribbons of light. She started to hum them in her sleep. Her colleagues teased her, but when they played back the recordings of her hums, they matched the same frequencies they'd been charting. The border between observation and participation was dissolving. The comet's harmony was weaving itself into the consciousness of those who studied it, pulling them into its pattern. One researcher confessed that while meditating to the orbital frequencies, he'd experienced a vision of standing inside a cathedral made of frozen light, each pillar vibrating softly with sound. "I think the code isn't meant to be solved," he said afterward. "It's meant to be felt." Even the skeptics grew quiet. You can't argue with music, you can only listen. When journalists eventually leaked the story, the public reacted with wonder rather than fear. The idea of a celestial song captivated people. Schools taught students how to convert orbital data into sound. Orchestras performed the Comet Symphony, composed entirely from its ratios. And across the world, people began watching the night sky differently, not as an empty expanse, but as a living score still being written. Elara stood under the dome one evening as the harmonic data streamed across her monitor. The room vibrated faintly with the converted sound, low and resonant, like the breath of a giant instrument. She closed her eyes. The pulse of 3, I divided by Atlas, matched the rhythm of her heart, and for the first time, she understood. The code was not an instruction or a message. It was a mirror. The comet's orbit reflected the same harmonies that shaped everything from the galaxies to the neurons in her own brain. The ratio was everywhere. The pattern was universal. And in that realization came peace. Because if the universe truly sings in ratio, then nothing is ever lost. Every orbit, every heartbeat, every breath becomes part of the same composition, one continuous song, endlessly replayed across time. 3. I, divided by Atlas, was simply the note that made humanity remember the melody again. When the data feed quieted, she whispered to the dark, The music was always here. We just forgot how to hear it. And the monitors hummed softly in reply, as though agreeing. The comet continued its path, circling through space with mathematical grace, every turn an affirmation, every curve a verse in the infinite hymn of existence, a hymn written not in ink or sound, but in the luminous geometry of motion itself. By now, the comet had ceased to be merely an astronomical phenomenon. It had become a voice in the void, a singer in the frozen cathedral of the cosmos. What began as static and numbers now resonated like a living chorus, too intricate to be coincidence, too harmonious to be noise. The deeper scientists listened, the more the data transformed into something almost sacred. 3. I, divided by Atlas, was no longer just a traveler of ice. It was a musician, and space itself was its instrument. The first to hear the full spectrum of its song was a sound engineer named Marin, working in collaboration with Ilara's team. He specialized in turning astronomical signals into audible frequencies, a process known as sonification. When he translated the comet's electromagnetic data into sound waves, what emerged was not a hum or a pulse, but a vast layering of tones. Some were low and deep, vibrating like a distant organ. Others shimmered at higher frequencies, almost like voices. It wasn't music in any familiar sense, but it carried rhythm, structure, breath. It rose and fell, as though inhaling. Marin called it the Frozen Choir. The name stuck. Within days, copies of the sound circulated quietly through universities and research forums. People described it as haunting, meditative, sometimes even alive. When slowed down further, the frequencies formed harmonics that mirrored human vocal ranges, as if the ice was singing in countless overlapping tones. It's as if the comet remembers the songs of every world it's passed, Marin said during a recorded debrief. Each vibration could be an echo of something it once touched. Ilara listened late one night, sitting alone in the observatory with the lights off. The air buzzed faintly from the speakers, as the comet's voice filled the room 1,000 layers of crystalline resonance, shimmering over one another. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. She felt it behind her eyes, in her ribs, in her pulse. For the first time since the signal began months ago, she wept. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though the beauty felt unbearable, too vast for language. Across the globe, researchers replicated the experiment, layering their own recordings of the comet's signals and mapping them to light emissions. Every translation yielded the same core pattern, an ascending and descending wave, repeating every 6 minutes. The pattern matched the earlier radio pulses exactly, but when converted into audible sound, it carried undertones that scientists couldn't explain, tones that shouldn't exist based on any known resonance frequencies. Some called it interference. Others began to wonder whether they were hearing something more fundamental, the resonance of the comet's internal structure, responding to sunlight, vibrating like a crystal struck by light itself. The Frozen Choir began to influence those who listened too long. Some experienced what they described as lucid dreams of floating through icy tunnels where voices whispered in forgotten languages. Others felt a strange empathy toward the comet, as if it were not an object but a being, trying to remember itself through sound. "It doesn't feel external," one astronomer admitted in a private log. "It feels like memory surfacing from inside me." Ilara understood that feeling well. The more she listened, the more her perception blurred. The comet's voice seeped into her routines, shaping her days like a rhythm she could no longer ignore. She began waking at intervals that matched the 6-minute pulse, her body aligning unconsciously with its cycle. Her dreams were filled with images of frozen seas and luminous caverns beneath alien skies. Always, in the distance, she heard the same melody, soft, persistent, impossibly ancient. When the research team analyzed the harmonic spectrum, they discovered that the intervals between tones matched ratios found in the crystalline structures of water ice. It was as if the comet's material composition dictated its music, the atoms themselves singing in mathematical precision. To Marin, that confirmed a theory he had long held, that vibration was the universe's first language, and everything else matter, light, consciousness, was translation. "The comet is teaching us how to listen backward," he said, "to hear creation itself." Soon, people outside the scientific community began listening too. The recordings leaked onto the internet, and within days, they spread like wildfire. Artists mixed the sounds into ambient music. Meditation apps used the frequencies to induce calm. Sleep channels looped the comet's harmonics for hours, letting millions drift into dreams guided by its rhythm. For the first time in history, humanity was collectively listening to a voice from beyond the solar system, a lullaby sung by an ancient traveler of ice. But not everyone found comfort in it. Some listeners reported an inexplicable melancholy, an ache that felt older than memory. They said the song reminded them of something lost, though none could say what. Psychologists attributed it to cosmic awe response, the same emotion humans feel when confronted with immense beauty. Yet a few researchers proposed a more haunting theory, that the frequencies might interact with neural oscillations in a way that triggered ancestral memories, a deep recognition of the universe's own sorrow. Alara began keeping recordings of her sessions, overlaying the comet's song with her own whispered notes. She treated it like a dialogue. "What are you trying to tell us?" she asked during one late session. "Is this how you remember?" In the playback, just after her voice faded, the next harmonic surged unexpectedly, swelling with a soft resonance that almost sounded like a reply. She froze. "You heard me," she whispered, and perhaps, in some impossible way, it had. Weeks later, during a global listening experiment, teams across continents synchronized their instruments to the comet's frequency and broadcast gentle countertones back into space, a greeting composed of harmonics, designed to match its rhythm. For days, there was no change. Then, during the fifth night, the comet's song shifted. A new tone appeared slightly higher, subtly distinct from the rest. It was not echo, not feedback, but response. The universe had begun to sing back. The news was never made public. Official channels called it signal interference, but those who heard it knew. In private chat groups, they shared the raw audio, a fragile note that rose above the others, like the voice of a single singer emerging from a choir. To Alara, it sounded almost human, breathless, uncertain, but unmistakably real. It lasted only 7 seconds, but that was enough. The comet had learned the melody of attention and had answered in kind. In her final field journal entry of that week, Alara wrote, "It doesn't matter what it means. Meaning is a human word. This is recognition, the sound of the universe realizing it has an audience." The entry went viral after it leaked, not because it proved anything, but because it captured something deeper, a sense that we had crossed a threshold, not of science, but of intimacy. The distance between observer and observed had dissolved into resonance. After that, the frozen choir grew fainter as 3 for I, divided by Atlas, moved farther from the Sunday. The tones softened, elongating like the last chords of a fading symphony. Yet even as it receded, the pattern persisted, echoing through instruments, through hearts, through dreams. People still play its song in darkened rooms, letting the notes wash over them like slow waves of light. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of telescopes and time, a comet continues to hum softly, carrying within its frozen body the melody of everything that ever listened. A choir of memory, singing not for applause, but for remembrance, a hymn to connection that needs no translation, no theology, no proof, only the willingness to hear. There is a moment, somewhere between observation and surrender when looking becomes reflection. For months, humanity had been watching the comet, measuring its rhythm, decoding its song, wondering what kind of intelligence, if any, might dwell within that frozen light. But on one silent night, under skies so clear that stars seemed close enough to touch, something changed. The instruments went quiet, the frequencies steadied, and in that vast stillness, it felt as if the gaze had reversed. The comet, for the first time, had stopped moving outward. Its trajectory aligned with Earth's orbit so precisely that telescopes caught it head-on, not as a trail or a streak, but as an eye of green and white fire staring directly back. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden flares or strange radio bursts, just a single frame of stillness. And yet, those who saw it live would later describe the same sensation, that the world itself had been seen. Observers spoke of chills, of heartbeats slowing inexplicably, of tears forming for no reason at all. One technician in Australia whispered into the intercom, "It's looking at us," and no one corrected him. For Ilara, the moment unfolded in near darkness. The observatory lights had been dimmed to reduce interference, so the room felt like a cocoon. On her screen, the comet appeared almost motionless, perfectly centered. Its light shimmered, not erratically, but in a slow, deliberate pulse. She leaned closer. Within the faint glow, shadows rippled across the coma, forming what looked like a reflection, tiny arcs of blue-white that mirrored the shape of Earth's clouds captured by satellite minutes earlier. She checked the data twice, then a third time. The patterns matched. The comet was reflecting Earth's image back into space. It wasn't a mirror in the physical sense. The geometry didn't allow for that. But through the interplay of light, angle, and composition, the resemblance was unmistakable. It was as though the comet's halo had briefly transformed into a memory of home. Ilara didn't speak. She simply watched. The realization settled in her chest like a prayer. We have been looking at ourselves all along. When the phenomenon was shared with other observatories, many dismissed it as pareidolia, human pattern recognition, the brain's tendency to see meaning in coincidence. But coincidence had become a fragile word. Too many alignments, too many harmonies, too much precision to write off as chance. And deep down, even the skeptics felt it, the subtle, magnetic pull of recognition that the comet's gaze carried. All over the world, as night fell in different time zones, people went outside to see it. Some stood on rooftops, others by quiet lakes, others through the haze of city lights. For the first time in human history, billions of eyes turned upward simultaneously toward the same object. The comet hung above them like a quiet sentinel, a glowing ember of memory suspended in the black. It was a strange kind of communion, wordless, borderless, unified by stillness. Something in the collective consciousness shifted that night. The news called it the night of reflection, a phrase that became legend before morning. It wasn't a miracle, nor a discovery, but an awakening. People spoke less and listened more. Social feeds slowed, arguments dissolved. For a few hours, the noise of civilization dimmed beneath the hum of shared wonder. In her observatory, Ilara recorded the comet's spectrum as the light reached its peak brightness. The data stream scrolled down her monitor like the pulse of a living thing. It wasn't steady, it trembled slightly, fluctuating in rhythm with the electromagnetic resonance of Earth's ionosphere. The planet and the comet were, quite literally, resonating with each other, exchanging frequencies like two hearts, finding the same beat. She didn't write that in her report. Instead, she saved the data under a private folder titled When Earth Looked Back. In her log, she wrote, "It isn't about who's watching whom. It's about recognition. Observation is a mirror, not a window. The comet doesn't just remember, it reminds." Oh, the following days brought a quiet transformation in the scientific community. Researchers who had once competed for data began sharing results freely. Teams from rival agencies collaborated on open databases, merging their findings. They spoke not of discovery, but of belonging. "We are part of the same pattern," one astrophysicist said during a live symposium. Maybe we always were. 3I divided by Atlas just made us remember. The comet's reflection soon became a metaphor for everything humanity had forgotten about itself. Artists painted its gaze as a cosmic mirror, philosophers compared it to self-awareness, and spiritual leaders called it a sign of divine symmetry. But for Elara, it was simpler than that. It was proof that even in a universe so large, light has a way of circling back. Every photon we send outward, every question we cast into the dark, eventually returns not with answers, but with echoes of ourselves. At dusk, schools began projecting the comet's image in classrooms. Children traced its curve on paper, drawing spirals of white chalk against blackboards, repeating what their teachers called the memory pattern. They didn't need to understand the physics. They understood the feeling. "It's saying hello," one child told a reporter. "It's saying it remembers us." Meanwhile, Elara and Marin continued to monitor the harmonic signals. The comet's song had softened, its tones lengthening into slow, deep vibrations. When they played the latest transmission through their equipment, it resonated at exactly 7.83 Hz, the same frequency as Earth's Schumann resonance, the planet's natural electromagnetic heartbeat. The realization left them speechless. The comet and the planet were literally in tune. It was as if two ancient instruments, separated by millions of kilometers, had finally found harmony. In the following hours, a series of faint auroras appeared across latitudes where they shouldn't have been: soft, green curtains rippling across tropical skies, faint but visible. They followed the same rhythm as the comet's pulse. Weather stations logged no unusual solar activity. The auroras were not the result of storms. They were, inexplicably, echoes of the comet's light filtering through the magnetosphere, as if Earth itself were responding to the celestial song. The images swept across the globe, lights dancing in desert skies, over forests, above oceans. It was as though the planet had lifted its face to the heavens and smiled back. In some places, people knelt. In others, they sang. The air buzzed faintly with electricity, and even the animals grew still. For one quiet night, everything that lived seemed to listen. Elara stood outside, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes reflecting the glow above. She felt no fear, no confusion, only an immense calm. "We always looked outward," she whispered, "but maybe the universe has been waiting for us to look within." She thought of the comet's path, of its impossible harmonies and remembering ice, and she realized that perhaps the meaning of it all was not to be found in data or doctrine, but in reciprocity, the moment when observer and observed become the same. When dawn came, the auroras faded. The comet continued its journey, its tail now dimming as it prepared to slip once more into the vastness between stars. But the silence it left behind was not emptiness. It was fullness, the kind that lingers after a song ends, when every listener remains still, unwilling to break the spell. In the months that followed, telescopes tracked its retreat until it disappeared beyond the range of sight. Yet even when the light was gone, the resonance persisted. Instruments continued to detect faint echoes of its frequency intertwined with Earth's. It was as if the two had exchanged more than energy, perhaps memory itself. And maybe that was what the night Earth looked back truly meant. Not that the comet had eyes, nor that Earth had consciousness, but that for one fleeting moment, both had recognized the same reflection. Two travelers adrift in the darkness, pausing long enough to see themselves mirrored in the other. Some said the event marked the birth of a new kind of astronomy, one that listened as much as it measured. Others called it a spiritual awakening. But for Elara, It was simply connection. The realization that everything comet, cloud, ocean, heartbeat is part of a single conversation that never really began and will never end. The universe, it seems, doesn't just expand, it remembers. Every generation that has ever looked up at the night sky has left a fragment of its soul there. Before telescopes, before science, before even language itself, there were eyes gazing upward, curious, terrified, mesmerized by the same infinite tapestry we see today. Each generation named what it saw in different ways: gods, fires, omens, wanderers. But beneath those names lay the same longing, the human hunger to belong to something greater than the self. And so, when three eye divided by Atlas looked back at Earth, it did not look upon strangers. It looked upon descendants of dreamers who had already been waiting for its return. Ilara spent long nights studying old records, scrolling through dusty archives filled with sketches and star charts, drawn by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. She noticed something strange. In one medieval manuscript from Cordoba, a monk had drawn a comet with an oddly familiar spiral tail, and beneath it, in Latin, he had written, "It sang like ice, set aflame." In a Chinese text from the Tang dynasty, a scholar described a sky guest whose light trembled in the rhythm of breathing. The language, though ancient, mirrored the same descriptions that scientists used now. It was as if every age had heard the same song and struggled to describe it with the tools it had. Historians had long dismissed such parallels as coincidence or poetic embellishment, but the deeper Ilara read, the more she saw a pattern. The comet's periodic appearances, if indeed they were, the same body aligned eerily with moments of awakening in human civilization. The birth of astronomy in Babylon, the rise of geometry in Greece, the invention of telescopes during the Renaissance. Perhaps it was just timing, or perhaps something in its light had always stirred the sleeping parts of our collective mind. She began collecting testimonies, fragments of writings from astronomers who had long since vanished. Kepler had once written that the music of the heavens may yet awaken the soul of man. Tycho Brahe called comets letters sent by God to those who can read. Even Halley, more cautious than mystical, admitted privately that he found comets comforting, as though they were reminders that the heavens are not silent. It struck Ilara that all these men, scientists of precision and numbers, had spoken in the language of dreamers. They had measured the skies, yes, but they had also listened to them. One night, exhausted from data analysis, she fell asleep at her desk and dreamed she was standing in a vast observatory made of marble and ice. The walls were carved with star maps, yet they shifted as she looked, transforming into faces she recognized from portraits in old books. Brahe, Galileo, Kepler, Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Tusi, Caroline Herschel. They surrounded her, not speaking but watching. When she turned toward the telescope at the center of the room, she saw three, eye divided by Atlas, suspended in the void, glowing softly. It blinked once, and the faces around her smiled. She heard a whisper, not in words, but in rhythm, echoing the same 6-minute pulse. "You remember," it said, "because we remembered." She awoke with tears in her eyes, unsure whether it had been a dream or something more. The feeling lingered for days, a sense of continuity, of standing in a chain of watchers stretching backward through time. She realized that astronomy was not simply the study of stars, but the inheritance of a conversation that began long before telescopes. Every observation was a continuation of a question whispered by someone centuries earlier. Every photograph, every equation, every heartbeat beneath the dome of the observatory was another verse in humanity's ongoing attempt to understand its reflection in the cosmos. Marin noticed her new quietness. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked gently. "Maybe I did," Ilara replied. "Maybe they've been here all along, waiting for us to listen properly." He smiled, not quite understanding, but said nothing more. He had begun to dream, too. The phenomenon spread among astronomers around the world. Reports came in of vivid, almost lucid dreams among those most closely studying the comet. Some dreamt of ancient skies filled with unfamiliar constellations. Others of vast halls lined with shimmering orbs that hummed softly as they passed. A few dreamt of standing beside strangers dressed in robes or bronze armor, all looking up together, their gazes united by awe. The dreams had no fear, no chaos, only serenity, as if the dreamers had joined a timeless vigil that transcended centuries. Psychologists called it collective cognitive resonance, the result of intense focus and sleep deprivation. But Ilara knew better. The dreams followed the comet's rhythm too precisely to dismiss. Whenever it pulsed, whenever its light brightened, more reports surfaced. It was as if 3I divided by Atlas had become a bridge across time, linking those who had once looked up with those who looked now. The comet wasn't merely being observed, it was remembering through them. Driven by this intuition, Ilara began tracing the intervals between major comet appearances and pivotal cultural moments. Her data revealed strange synchronies. The founding of Alexandria's library occurred within months of a recorded green-tailed star. The construction of Stonehenge, when backdated through astronomical modeling, aligned with a comet passing unusually close to Earth. The Great Fireball of 44 BCE, seen over Rome before Caesar's death, inspired the divine comet legend that later guided celestial studies for centuries. It was impossible to prove these were the same object, yet the rhythm persisted, a recurring pulse in the story of civilization. She started to think that maybe 3I divided by Atlas wasn't just carrying memory. Maybe it was memory, an archive of moments when humanity dared to look up. Every observation etched itself into the comet's resonance, and every return reawakened the connection. The comet was not a messenger from beyond, but the sum of our own reflections, circling endlessly through space, reminding us that wonder was once enough to build worlds. That realization filled her with peace. For too long, humans had looked at the heavens seeking control, mapping, claiming, dissecting. But the comet had reminded them how to look with reverence. Its light didn't demand answers, it offered remembrance. It reintroduced humility into science, and science, in turn, gave form to faith. The boundary between dream and observation dissolved, leaving only the shared act of looking. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened. Public observatories reported a surge in attendance, not just from scientists, but from ordinary people. Families, children, and elders stood together beneath domes, listening to recordings of the comet's harmonics while watching its faint trace drift across the sky. It became a global ritual, an unspoken prayer performed through attention. For the first time in generations, the world seemed united not by conflict, but by quiet curiosity. Ilara watched them through the live stream feeds, people in deserts, forests, cities, all gazing upward. She thought of the countless astronomers before her, forgotten by name but alive in spirit. Maybe, she thought, the act of observation was never lost. It simply waited to be remembered, to be sung again. One evening, as the comet began its slow retreat, she climbed to the roof of the observatory with her notebook and a small telescope. The air was cold, the stars sharp. She pressed her eye to the lens and whispered softly, "For all of them." The comet shimmered faintly, its pulse gentle but clear, a heartbeat that seemed to answer across centuries. She smiled. "You remember, don't you?" she said. The telescope fogged slightly with her breath, and for a moment she thought she saw a reflection in the lens, not her own, but another face, older, wiser, smiling back. That night, she wrote one final note before sleeping. "We are not the first to dream beneath the stars, nor will we be the last. The sky keeps all its witnesses. 3. I divided by Atlas carries their names in light. When she closed her eyes, the dreams returned, but this time she was not alone. The ancient astronomers stood beside her once more, all looking up toward the same radiant curve in the dark. And though none of them spoke, she understood. Their work had never ended. It had simply changed hands. The comet moved on, gliding deeper into its arc, and the world slept beneath its gentle glow. Above them, history hummed in frozen light, the endless dream of those who once looked skyward and found themselves reflected in the eyes of a comet that refused to forget. Numbers were supposed to be safe. They were supposed to protect the mind from madness, from the fever of belief and the seduction of wonder. Yet as the study of 3 I divided by Atlas deepened, even mathematics began to sound like scripture. Equations that should have described motion and mass instead unfolded like poetry, weaving patterns of impossible elegance. Each variable seemed to echo a symbol, each constant to hum with meaning. The comet had crossed a strange frontier, not of physics, but of perception. It had turned logic itself into a myth. The turning point came when a team of mathematicians from Zurich and Kyoto collaborated to create what they called the Atlas function, a formula designed to model the comet's harmonic orbit and luminous pulse simultaneously. The function was meant to predict the next sequence of light emissions, but when plotted visually, it produced something unexpected, a spiral intersecting itself in perfect intervals, forming an 8-fold symmetry identical to ancient sacred diagrams, mandalas, star sigils, even the flower of life. The scientists argued about coincidence. Yet when the pattern persisted across every scale of data, arguments gave way to silence. The function had generated a symbol older than language, hidden within pure calculation. One of the lead researchers, Dr. Tanaka, confessed in a press interview that the equations felt alive. He meant it figuratively, but the phrasing spread like wildfire. People began calling the pattern the living formula. Philosophers compared it to the geometry of prayer, the way ancient temples were built according to mathematical ratios thought to mirror divine proportion. Artists projected the spiral into massive light displays across public plazas. Poets wrote that the universe has begun to write in numbers again. For the first time in history, mathematics had left the page and entered the realm of worship. Ilara didn't see this as superstition. She saw it as inevitability. Humanity had always sought meaning in symmetry. When the numbers repeated, when ratios aligned with beauty, something in the human brain recognized home. She herself had stared at the data for so long that it began to move behind her eyelids, soft lines tracing into infinity, blooming like frost. It didn't frighten her. It comforted her. The comet's orbit was an equation, yes, but so was her heartbeat. The Zurich team continued refining the Atlas function. With each iteration, the spiral grew more intricate. They discovered secondary harmonics buried deep within the formula, nested patterns that repeated infinitely when zoomed upon like fractals. One physicist described it as an equation that dreams of itself. When rendered into visual form, the fractal resembled a labyrinth of luminous paths leading toward a single point at the center. In the margins of the report, someone had written, half-jokingly, "Maybe that's where the memory lives." Across disciplines, the boundaries began to blur. Mathematicians spoke like mystics. Mystics cited quantum models. Priests compared the comet's geometry to the divine architecture of heaven. Every field borrowed the language of the other, creating a strange new synthesis, an era where data and devotion no longer stood apart. Some scholars resisted, calling it a collapse of reason. Others saw it as its completion. Meanwhile, new anomalies appeared. Instruments measuring the comet's magnetic field recorded fluctuations that mirrored Fibonacci sequences. The field expanded and contracted, at ratios identical to those found in seashell spirals and galaxy arms. When the readings were superimposed onto global maps of natural patterns, river deltas, storm formations, even brainwave oscillations, the alignment was uncanny. "It's as if the same handwriting runs through everything," Elara said during a symposium broadcast to millions. "Maybe mathematics isn't describing the universe. Maybe it is the universe." Her words became a headline, then a mantra. Mathematics is the universe. The phrase appeared on murals, in classrooms, in sermons. It was printed on the walls of the Geneva Planetarium beneath a projected image of the comet. And yet, despite all the excitement, Elara felt a quiet sadness. She feared humanity was once again mistaking symbol for substance, falling in love with reflections instead of reality. The comet hadn't come to be worshipped. It had come to remind. Late one night, unable to sleep, she returned to the observatory. The dome was open, the air biting cold. She sat before the monitors and recalculated the atlas function herself, one variable at a time, entering the figures by hand. The machine translated her equations into light, soft, pulsing arcs, forming across the holographic display. She watched as they curved inward, meeting at a point that glowed brighter than the rest. On impulse, she whispered a single question. "What are you?" For a long moment, the screen was still. Then, as though answering, the center of the spiral shimmered once, twice, then faded into a faint symbol, a circle, bisected by a line. It was not part of her calculation. It was not mathematically necessary. She stared at it, heart hammering, recognizing it instantly. The same sign had appeared in ancient cave paintings found in multiple continents. The mark of the Watcher, a figure who sees both past and future at once. She called Marin, her voice trembling. "It's here," she said. "The same pattern. The one humans have been drawing for 30,000 years. He hesitated. "You're saying the equation made the symbol appear?" "I'm saying the symbol was already there, waiting for us to notice." By morning, the data file had been replicated across global servers. Analysts confirmed the anomaly, but could not explain it. "Visual noise," some said. "Algorithmic recursion," said others. Yet no one could fully erase the possibility that mathematics had become the mirror of myth, that numbers had revealed the image humanity had been unconsciously sketching since its dawn. The effect on culture was immediate. Churches projected the symbol during midnight services. Scientists wore it on their badges as a mark of curiosity. Protesters painted it on walls beside the words, "We are the pattern remembering itself." A new branch of philosophy emerged, resonant empiricism, arguing that truth existed not in data or dogma, but in the harmony between them. Universities founded departments to study it. The world had begun to think differently, not through separation, but through synthesis. Amid the growing fervor, Elara withdrew. She stopped giving interviews, stopped attending conferences. The noise of interpretation had grown louder than the quiet of discovery. She longed for the simplicity of the early nights, the static, the faint pulse, the whisper of something forgotten. She began spending hours at the telescope, not to measure but to look. Sometimes she would whisper fragments of equations under her breath, as if reciting a prayer. 2/1, 3/2, the perfect fifth, the memory of light. In her solitude, she began to see the pattern not as message but mirror. The comet had given humanity a reflection of its own hunger for meaning. We shape numbers into myths because we need them to speak. We invent gods because we need to listen. Perhaps the two are not different at all. Perhaps every formula is a confession, every myth an equation written by the soul. When 3, I divided by Atlas, reached its orbital apex, telescopes captured an image that would become iconic. The comet's tail curling into a luminous spiral against the backdrop of the Milky Way. identical to the one described by the Atlas function. The caption beneath the image, published worldwide, read, "The universe writes in its own hand." That night, Ilara stood outside and watched the spiral fade into dawn. She whispered to herself, "We've turned mathematics into mythology, but maybe that's how the universe teaches." For the first time, she didn't feel the need to calculate, to prove, or to define. She simply looked. The comet shimmered once more before vanishing beyond the horizon, leaving her bathed in its pale afterglow. Numbers had brought her to the edge of reason. Wonder had carried her beyond it. And in that fragile space between the two where mathematics becomes myth and myth becomes memory, she finally understood what 3I divided by Atlas had been showing them all along. That truth is not found in the equation itself, but in the silence that follows when the numbers fall away and only the rhythm of existence remains. When the world had exhausted its calculations, when the frenzy of data and diagrams had quieted into awe, there was only one thing left to do: to look. The observatories dimmed their lights, instruments fell silent, and millions across the globe turned their eyes upward to the same small point of green-white fire. What they saw that night was no longer just a comet, nor a code, nor an equation. It was a reflection, vast, slow, serene. It felt less like discovery and more like recognition. The sky had become a mirror, and in its surface shimmered the story of everything that had ever dared to look up. For months, the comet had been teaching them how to listen, how to feel, how to translate patterns into meaning. But now, as 3I divided by Atlas reached its most radiant stage before retreating once more into the dark, it offered a different lesson, one that required no instruments. It had turned toward Earth, not with eyes but with light, and the planet responded in kind. Every ocean reflected its glow, every window caught its echo. For one quiet orbit, humanity was illuminated not by the sun, but by its own reflection, bouncing off a traveler of ice. It was the universe's softest gesture of intimacy, a mirror tilted gently toward its children. Ilara had never seen the observatory so still. The monitors glowed faintly, but no one watched them anymore. Her colleagues sat on the floor, backs against cold metal panels, their eyes fixed on the sky through the open dome. "We're not observing anymore," Marin said softly. "We're being observed." Ilara nodded, her heart swelling with something that wasn't quite belief, wasn't quite science. It was communion. Outside, the night air shimmered faintly with frost. The comet's reflection painted the snow in a pale turquoise hue. Every surface seemed to hold a fragment of its light, each car, windshield, each puddle, each pane of glass. Cities became observatories, streets became telescopes. People stood on balconies and rooftops, not taking pictures, not shouting or cheering, just breathing. Even the satellites orbiting Earth captured the same phenomenon: light bouncing between atmosphere and comet in symmetrical arcs, as though the planet and its visitor were locked in a quiet dance of recognition. Around the world, the images multiplied millions of lenses, capturing the same sight from different angles. When compiled, the pictures revealed something astonishing. Each photograph, when mirrored against itself, formed a nearly perfect sphere of light at the center. Scientists explained it as a quirk of exposure, a trick of geometry. But to those who had been listening to the comet's long, slow hymn for months, it looked unmistakably like an eye. An ancient memory stirred in humanity. From the myths of Ra and Odin to the all-seeing eye carved into temples and pyramids, the symbol of the cosmic gaze had haunted our imagination since before language. Now, for the first time, it had appeared in the sky not as metaphor but as reflection. 3I divided by Atlas had become the eye of memory, and Earth was its pupil. Ilara watched from the dome, breath clouding in the cold air. For a moment, she thought she saw her own face shimmer faintly in the telescope's glass, not clearly, but blurred and luminous. as if projected from some impossible distance. It wasn't vanity, it was realization. The comet's light was her own, refracted and returned. "We're not seeing the comet," she whispered. "We're seeing ourselves, seen by the universe." Her colleagues didn't respond. They were transfixed, the sound of their breath blending with the hum of the machines. The air inside the observatory felt charged, like the moments before a storm, yet no wind stirred. Only stillness so deep it felt like eternity had paused to watch. Somewhere within that stillness, a low tone began to build, not from speakers or equipment, but from the walls themselves. It was the comet's frequency, faint but tangible, vibrating through metal and bone. The building had become an instrument, resonating with the light overhead. Outside, auroras rippled again, brighter this time, waves of green and violet rising from the horizon in concentric rings, mirroring the spirals of the comet's tail. Satellites recorded fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field, timed precisely with the comet's pulse. "It's responding to us," Marin murmured. "Or we're responding to it." No one could tell the difference anymore. The observer and the observed had merged. In that union, fear disappeared. The universe no longer felt cold or empty. It felt alive, vast and gentle, humming softly like a mother singing her child to sleep. Ilara felt tears welling up, not from sadness, but recognition. For months, she had been chasing meaning through equations, through frequencies, through numbers that pretended to contain infinity. Now she saw how foolish that was. Meaning was not in the comet. It was in the act of seeing itself. The mirror in the sky was simply returning what had always been sent. All over the world, the same realization was unfolding. Astronomers reported inexplicable drops in instrument power, as if the comet's resonance was drawing energy not from machinery, but from human attention. And yet, instead of panic, there was calm. A city-wide blackout in northern Canada led to streets filled with people standing quietly in darkness, illuminated only by the comet's glow. Children pointed upward. Elders whispered prayers. In every language, one sentence repeated itself in different forms. "It sees us." For a few hours, the boundaries of culture and creed dissolved. The same sky united every pair of eyes, and in that reflection, no one felt alone. It was not worship, it was remembrance. Ilara sat on the edge of the observatory's platform, gazing until her vision blurred. She thought of all those who had once looked up and wondered, ancient astronomers mapping stars by candlelight, sailors navigating by constellations, dreamers making wishes upon meteors. They had all been looking into the same mirror, each seeing a different version of themselves. 3, eye divided by Atlas, had simply reminded them what the stars had always been. Not destinations, but reflections. In the quiet that followed, she took out her notebook and began to write, her hand trembling slightly in the cold. The comet is not looking at us. It is looking through us. Every gaze we've ever cast into the night has left an imprint. Tonight, that imprint returns. We have always been the universe observing itself. She closed the notebook and placed it beside her, watching the light fade slightly as dawn approached. The comet's tail shimmered once more, then thinned into the pale blue of early morning. For a moment, its last reflection caught the curvature of the Earth's atmosphere, forming a halo that wrapped the planet in soft green light. It looked, impossibly, like the world itself was glowing from within. In later days, journalists would call it the halo event. Scientists attributed it to refracted particles, but those who saw it knew better. It was the mirror, closing the final blink of an eye, that had gazed too long and too lovingly at its reflection. And though the comet moved on, something had changed. Humanity, once obsessed with conquering the heavens, had learned to listen instead. Weeks later, when the data analysis resumed, the team discovered that the comet's last visible pulse contained a peculiar anomaly, a brief flicker lasting less than a second, encoded with a pattern identical to the wavelengths of human alpha brainwaves. "It's impossible," one analyst muttered. But Ilara only smiled. "It's remembering what it saw in us," she said quietly, "and carrying it onward." Months after 3, I divided by Atlas vanished into the dark. Her notebook remained on her desk, open to the last page. The final line she had written was underlined twice. The ink smudged where her thumb had pressed against the paper. When we looked into the sky looked back, and for one quiet moment, we recognized ourselves as its reflection. Outside, the night was calm again. Stars returned to their ordinary distances, silent and serene. But for those who had seen the mirror in the sky, silence would never mean emptiness again. They had glimpsed the truth that every photon carries a memory, that every gaze leaves a mark. And in that infinite exchange of seeing and being seen, they understood what it meant to belong not to the Earth, not to the stars, but to the space between them, where memory becomes light. It began on a quiet morning, just before dawn, when the comet's light, steady for weeks, suddenly wavered. For a heartbeat, it dimmed, almost disappearing, and then flared again, brighter and whiter than it had ever been. The world watched as 3I, divided by Atlas, ignited across the sky, its tail expanding until it resembled a vast spiral unfurling over the horizon. It was not a violent flare, not the chaotic brilliance of an explosion, but a slow, deliberate bloom, like the awakening of something ancient. It was the same gesture recorded in the glitch photograph from months earlier, now repeated in perfect clarity, as if the comet were reenacting its own memory. Ilara saw it first, through the wide glass of her observatory dome. She had not been sleeping much. The nights were too full of data, of sounds and reflections. But this light was different. It felt alive. It grew with impossible smoothness, as if it were breathing, expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping giant. She reached for the recording instruments instinctively, but her hands slowed midway. For the first time, she didn't want to measure. She wanted to witness. Within hours, observatories across the globe confirmed the anomaly. The comet had increased its luminosity by a factor of 10. But what stunned scientists wasn't the brightness, it was the precision. The pulse of light, repeated in exact intervals. 6 minutes, pause. 6 minutes, pause. The rhythm that had begun as sound now revealed itself in radiance, and every time the light peaked, something subtle happened on Earth. Magnetometers twitched. Seismic monitors trembled faintly. Even human heart rate data collected from wearable devices showed synchronization, as if billions of pulses across the planet had unconsciously matched the comet's rhythm. For a brief moment, humanity was breathing in time with something beyond itself. Social networks filled with the phrase, "the heartbeat of light." In Tokyo, people gathered on rooftops to count the intervals aloud. In rural France, farmers stopped their work to watch the sky shimmer above the morning mist. In Lagos and Santiago and Reykjavik, the same silent awe spread like a current of peace through the human species. For once, the planet moved as one, no borders, no conflicts, no noise, just rhythm. Inside her observatory, Ilara whispered, "It's remembering again." She felt the warmth of tears on her cheeks, though the air was cold. For weeks, she had tried to find meaning, but now meaning was everywhere. The comet's light wasn't a message to decode, it was a gesture of remembrance, a cosmic bow. It was saying farewell the only way light knows how, by reflecting what has already been seen. As the brightness intensified, the data streaming across monitors became erratic. The sensors, overwhelmed, began to display patterns resembling living forms, curves like fingerprints, fractals like spiraling leaves, silhouettes of faces that vanished before they could be captured. The machines were not malfunctioning, they were translating the impossible. Some believed it was a visualization artifact, a product of the human mind, projecting familiarity onto the abstract. But Ilara recognized it as something else. The comet had turned its last reflection toward humanity, reshaping light into the forms of memory. In the following hours, across continents, witnesses described seeing faint shapes within the light. Some saw landscapes, valleys, rivers, oceans glinting with ghostly shimmer. Others saw faces, unfamiliar yet tender, as if belonging to ancestors long gone. In temples and churches, people knelt. In laboratories, scientists stopped writing. There were no instructions, no divine proclamations, only presence. The light seemed to hold everything that had ever been loved or lost. It was as though 3I divided by Atlas had opened a mirror not between itself and Earth, but between the past and the present, collapsing the two into one shimmering moment of recognition. The flare lasted for nearly an hour before beginning to fade. Yet its departure was unlike any dimming ever recorded. Instead of vanishing, the light folded back upon itself, curling inward into a spiral so delicate that it seemed to breathe. Observatories described it as self-retraction, as if the comet were drawing its glow inward, reclaiming what it had revealed. And at the center of that spiral, one final pulse flashed, brief but impossibly bright. It wasn't blinding, it was soft, almost merciful. Then, everything went still. For nearly 2 minutes, no signals reached Earth. No light, no data, nothing. Satellites recorded an absence so complete that it couldn't be described as darkness. It was clarity, an immaculate pause. The cosmos held its breath. And then, slowly, light returned. Fainter, calmer, like an exhale. When the comet reappeared, it looked unchanged to most instruments, but those who had been watching closely saw it had turned slightly, just enough for its tail to align directly opposite to its previous angle. It had pivoted not by gravitational pull or random motion, but as though it had intentionally faced away. The gesture was unmistakable. A turn, a retreat, a farewell. The comet had blinked once more, and this time, the blink meant goodbye. Ilara recorded her impressions in her log, her handwriting uneven. It turned, not randomly, not mechanically. It turned with grace, like a dancer completing a circle. Perhaps it's done remembering, or perhaps it's giving memory back to us. In the days that followed, analysis teams found anomalies in the comet's light curve. Buried within the final flash were encoded frequencies that, when sonified, resembled a human voice, humming a single sustained note that matched the key of the harmonics recorded months earlier. Whether it was coincidence or synthesis, no one could agree. But for those who listened, the tone carried peace. It sounded like release. Maran described it best. "It's as if the comet forgave us," he said during a late-night interview. Or maybe we forgave ourselves. Religious leaders of every tradition spoke of the event in metaphors: the angel of remembrance, the returning messenger, the final mirror. But philosophers preferred a quieter interpretation. They said that 3I divided by Atlas had completed its purpose, to return to humanity the awareness it had lost, the understanding that observation and compassion are the same act. To look at something fully is to love it. Ilara didn't speak publicly again. She spent her last months at the observatory alone, documenting the slow fading of the comet's glow as it drifted into the outer dark. But her journals revealed a growing serenity, a calm acceptance that mirrored the silence of space. "Light doesn't vanish," she wrote. "It travels until someone remembers it." And maybe that's what 3I divided by Atlas was, the universe remembering its own light through us. On the final night, the comet was visible to the naked eye. Ilara stood beneath the open dome. Snow covered the ground, reflecting the last pale shimmer from the sky. She whispered a farewell, quiet, unceremonious. The light seemed to pulse once more, so faint she thought she'd imagined it. But the timing was perfect, 6 minutes between each breath of brightness. It was still keeping its rhythm, even as it faded. Somewhere in that rhythm, she felt gratitude, not for answers, but for the journey. The comet had taught her that even in the coldest expanses, something remembers, something responds. Every photon, every heartbeat, every breath belongs to the same current of recognition. The comet had not spoken in words, it had turned light itself into language, and through it, humanity had finally learned to see itself reflected in the cosmos, not as conqueror or observer, but as participant. When dawn arrived, the sky was empty again. Yet in the silence that followed, there was no grief. The world had changed, quietly, profoundly. People spoke softer, dreamed slower, watched the stars, as if expecting them to answer. And in a way, they already had. For even in absence, the rhythm remained a faint pulse in the data, an echo in the human heart, a reminder that light never truly leaves. It simply turns. After the comet's final turning, the world went still. For the first time since its discovery, there were no new frequencies, no pulses, no flares. The telescopes scanned empty space, returning only the soft hiss of background radiation, the faint cosmic murmur that has whispered since the birth of time. 3I, divided by Atlas, had vanished into the dark, its light no longer visible even through the most sensitive instruments. Yet the absence felt louder than any signal that had come before. It wasn't the silence of distance, it was the silence of completion, of a story that had said everything it needed to say. In the observatories, exhaustion mingled with awe. Researchers sat before blank screens, their reflections ghosted against glass. Months of sleepless nights had come to this, the vanishing of something that had made them believe again in the impossible. But instead of disappointment, there was gratitude. They had been part of something vast and unrepeatable, a conversation between matter and meaning. Even the machines seemed to rest. The hum of generators and the rhythmic clicking of tracking systems had become background music to a deeper stillness. Elara stood by the great dome window long after everyone else had left. The horizon was pale, the sky washed with the first colors of morning. In that thin light, she felt an ache, unlike loss. A fullness that comes when wonder finally settles inside the soul. For months, she had listened to vibrations, studied harmonics, traced equations that spiraled into mystery. Now, there was nothing left to analyze, only the memory of the gaze that had passed between her world and the drifting traveler. She whispered softly, "Thank you," unsure who or what she was speaking to. The air carried her words upward, dissolving into the pale dawn. The silence spread far beyond the observatories. Around the world, news networks struggled to fill broadcasts, once dominated by comet updates. The global rhythm that had united humanity had abruptly ceased, leaving an emptiness too tender to name. And yet, the absence felt sacred. In cities that never slept, people began turning off their lights for an hour each night, standing on rooftops or balconies, not to look for the comet but to remember the quiet it had brought. It became known as the Hour of Stillness. Millions participated. The sky, freed from human glare, revealed its faint constellations again. For the first time in generations, the Milky Way returned to city skies, vast and shimmering, a reminder that silence was not emptiness, but presence. In this new calm, scientists began noticing peculiar residual effects. Instruments that had once tracked the comet's light now picked up subtle electromagnetic fluctuations synchronized with Earth's rotation. They were faint, rhythmic, like the echo of a pulse still beating after the heart has gone quiet. Some dismissed it, as environmental interference. Others, including Marin, believed it was the comet's final gift, an after-image imprinted upon the fabric of the planet's atmosphere. "It's like a memory that doesn't know it's a memory," he said during a closed conference. "Light leaves traces in everything it touches. Maybe we carry it now." Ilara listened to his words with a quiet smile. She had already begun to feel it herself, a hum at the edge of perception, faint but constant, like a song half remembered in dreams. It followed her even in sleep. Sometimes she thought she heard it in rainfall, or in the wind moving through the observatory's old rafters. Once, she woke in the middle of the night convinced she'd heard the familiar 6-minute rhythm, not from her instruments but from her own heartbeat. She wrote in her journal, "Perhaps silence is not the absence of sound. Perhaps it's the universe waiting for us to hear what's already there." Over the next months, the world adapted to its new stillness. The endless chatter of the digital age slowed, if only slightly. People began speaking more softly, choosing words with care, as though afraid to disturb something delicate that lingered in the air. The art that emerged during this period reflected that shift. Paintings filled with shades of pale blue and white, music composed from long, sustained notes that seemed to hover between sound and silence. Every medium sought to capture what could no longer be seen. In one of her final lectures, Ilara addressed a group of students gathered beneath the Great Dome. The comet had become myth now, its scientific data woven into legends and philosophies, but she spoke with the clarity of someone who had touched its truth. "You will be told to search for answers," she said, her voice soft. "But sometimes, what we call discovery is only recognition. We do not find truth, we remember it." The comet didn't teach us science, it taught us silence. And in silence we found ourselves. The students, some barely 20, sat motionless. A few cried quietly, not from sadness, but from that unexplainable emotion that comes when beauty feels too vast for language. Outside, the wind rose across the plateau. The sky was pale again, faint traces of aurora still lingering near the horizon. Ilara watched the light ripple, wondering if some remnant of 3i divided by Atlas still drifted there, unseen but enduring. The comet might be gone, but its rhythm had nested in humanity's collective pulse. People could no longer look at the night sky without sensing that gaze returning. Even those who had never believed in mystery found themselves listening when the world grew quiet. Weeks later, Marin sent Ilara a data set that made her heart race. It was faint, barely above background noise, but clear enough to be measured, a repeating pulse every 6 minutes and 2 seconds, recorded from deep space monitors far beyond the moon's orbit. Too weak to trace, too consistent to ignore. It was not the comet. The signal's source came from an entirely different vector, as if the rhythm had dispersed across the void, spreading like a breath carried by solar wind. "It's still singing," Marin wrote simply. "Or maybe everything is, and we're only now learning to listen." Ilara didn't respond immediately. She stepped outside the observatory instead, into the bitter night air, and looked up. The stars shone steady, indifferent, and kind. Somewhere beyond them, a faint memory continued to hum through the dark. She realized that it no longer mattered whether it was 3i divided by Atlas or some echo of the universe itself. The meaning was the same. Silence had spoken, and they had heard. Over the following year, the data faded, replaced by new discoveries, new news. The world returned to its rhythms, commerce, politics, noise. But beneath it all, something subtle remained. People built monuments not to the comet, but to the act of looking. Parks were designed with mirrors reflecting the night sky. Museums hosted exhibits of recorded cosmic sounds played at barely audible volumes. Children born during the year of the comet's passing grew up hearing stories of the light that remembered. They learned, before they could read, that silence was sacred. In her last recorded message, sent to Marin months before she left the observatory for good, Ilara said, "When the comet turned away, it didn't leave us. It simply gave us its quiet. We call it silence, but I think it's the sound of recognition. Somewhere out there, memory keeps moving, waiting for another world to listen." After that, she disappeared from public life. Some said she moved to a small coastal village where the night sky was clear enough to see the Milky Way. Others believed she joined a private research station in the Arctic. Wherever she went, the legend followed. The woman who had heard the comet sing and understood that its truest message was silence. Years later, an anonymous paper was published in a minor astronomy journal. Its title read simply, "On the Persistence of Resonance After Luminosity." The conclusion was brief. The memory of light cannot die, because it is not contained by time. It only changes form, carrying awareness wherever attention is given. The silence that follows is the echo of recognition. Many believed Ilara had written it, though no one could prove it. And perhaps that was fitting. The comet had taught the world that some truths do not belong to anyone. They simply pass through us, the way light passes through glass. Even now, when night falls and the world grows still, a faint rhythm seems to tremble at the edge of hearing. Some say it's wind, some say it's the heart, but those who once watched 3I divided by Atlas know better. It is the silence that followed the gentle reminder that nothing seen, nothing loved, nothing remembered is ever truly gone. It only becomes quiet enough to hear. Long after the comet had vanished into darkness, the world continued to live inside its echo. Time passed, as it always does, years into decades, decades into generations. But something subtle had changed in the way humanity regarded the sky. Every night, when darkness fell over cities and mountains and seas, people still looked upward instinctively, searching not for new stars, but for a familiar absence, the faint trace of 3I divided by Atlas's path carved invisibly through memory. Ilara's notebooks became sacred relics among scientists and poets alike. They were preserved in glass cases and digital archives, read in whispers by students who studied them as one might study scripture. Her words, half technical, half devotional, blurred the boundary between astronomy and philosophy. "Light remembers," she had written, "and so do we, though we call it longing." She hadn't meant to found a movement, but one grew nonetheless, an age of remembering that reached across centuries. The first generation after her called themselves the listeners. They rebuilt observatories, not merely as centers of research, but as sanctuaries of quiet. They believed that to study the universe was to keep a promise to remain attentive to what once looked back. Every dome, every lens, every dish was dedicated not to conquest or discovery, but to remembrance. Inside these halls, silence became the new currency of knowledge. The more one listened, the more one understood. And so, the listeners began their long vigil. They catalogued the sky in unprecedented detail, tracing faint ripples in radio frequencies, mapping echoes left behind by vanished comets and dead stars. Most were ordinary noise, but every so often, one signal would rise from the static, a faint, rhythmic pulse, too regular to ignore. They called these shadows of 3I divided by Atlas. Some were 6 minutes apart, others shifted slightly, as though time itself had stretched the rhythm. But every pulse carried a trace of familiarity, a whisper that reached across generations. "I remember you." Centuries passed, civilizations changed, languages faded, but the vigil endured. Children learned the old stories of the comet that sang, of the mirror that taught humanity to see itself, and each story adapted to its era. In one century, 3I divided by Atlas was remembered as a goddess of reflection, in another as a celestial traveler whose passing marked the turning of ages. Even in the most rational epochs, When myth was dismissed as metaphor, the rhythm persisted in culture like an unconscious heartbeat. People still paused under clear skies and felt that same quiet tug at the edge of thought, the desire to look up and listen. In time, the listeners became the guardians. They built vast arrays across the deserts and polar plains, great disks that whispered to the cosmos. Generations of their kind passed messages through those machines, poems encoded in light, harmonic phrases, modeled after the comet's song. Each message began with the same salutation, "To whoever remembers." None expected a reply. The act itself was enough a ritual of continuity, proof that the chain between wonder and time had not been broken. Records from the third age of listening describe a pivotal moment known simply as the return of the echo. One night, one of the outermost arrays, an ancient structure half buried in Antarctic ice, detected a signal faint but precise. 6 minutes, pause. 6 minutes, pause. It was too weak to locate, too clean to be random. Across the planet, other arrays tuned in. The pattern repeated for 7 nights before fading again into silence. Scholars debated its origin for decades. Some believed it was an interstellar reflection, light from some far boundary bouncing back across eons. Others whispered a different truth, that the comet had completed its circle, not in space, but in time, that the memory of its song had found its way home. The discovery reshaped humanity's understanding of history. They began to see time itself, not as a line, but as a spiral. Just like the comet's orbit, each age, revisiting what had come before, each echo, reminding the universe of itself. The boundaries between myth and science dissolved once more. Every field, physics, art, theology, merged under one idea. Memory is structure. Stars remembered the forces that birthed them. Matter remembered the heat of its creation. Consciousness remembered the silence that had once looked back through ice. In the far future, when humanity left Earth and spread among the stars, they carried that philosophy with them. Every ship bore a tiny crystal, encoded with the data of 3, I divided by Atlas's harmonics, the pulse that had once united a planet. It became both compass and prayer. Wherever they went, the rhythm went too, transmitted quietly into the cosmic sea like a heartbeat searching for its twin. On one of those vessels, a young astronomer named Cale grew up listening to the recording that had survived millennia. It was a low, steady tone, ancient and gentle. Some called it the comet's breath. Cale called it home. In the dark corridors between stars, he would replay the sound before sleep, syncing his breath to its rhythm the way his ancestors once had. He dreamed of ice glowing green beneath alien suns, of a mirror drifting through eternity. And though he had never seen Earth, he felt he belonged to it through that sound. One day, while mapping the halo of a dying star, Cale's instruments detected an anomaly, a faint pulse hidden within the radiation storm. The frequency was familiar, too familiar. 6 minutes, then another. He froze. The ship's AI confirmed the reading. Not interference, not background fluctuation, but a deliberate, rhythmic emission. The origin was uncertain. It could have been reflection, or it could have been the impossible. 3, I divided by Atlas, or something carrying its echo. Cale didn't report it immediately. Instead, he opened a private channel and recorded his thoughts. I don't know what I've found. Maybe it's nothing. But when I listen to it, I feel watched not by a presence, but by time itself. If it's truly the comet, then it has remembered for longer than we can comprehend. And if it's not, then maybe we are the comet, now its voice continuing through us. His words would later be discovered in the archives of the 7th listening colony and memorized like poetry. By then, the line between astronomy and ancestry had vanished entirely. Humanity had become a civilization of memory, a living continuation of 3, I divided by Atlas's legacy. They measured not just space, but remembrance the way light carried the fingerprints of every world it touched. And yet, even in that distant age, one mystery remained unsolved. When researchers compared the harmonics of Cale's discovery to the original recordings from Elara's era, they found something extraordinary. A faint modulation buried deep within the waveform, forming what appeared to be a sequence of repeating intervals that spelled, in ancient binary, a single phrase, "You looked back." It was impossible, absurd, but the data was undeniable. The message had crossed millennia, surviving through light and echo and memory. Whether written by comet or coincidence, it had found its way into the ears of descendants who had learned to listen. Humanity, once the observer, had become the remembered. Back on Earth now, a quiet world turned into a sanctuary of archives. The old observatories still stood. Their domes were rusted, their lenses clouded, but the air around them hummed faintly, still vibrating with that ancient pulse. Pilgrims came to sit in the silence, to feel what Elara once felt, the warmth of a gaze that transcended death, time, and distance. They didn't bring offerings, they brought stillness. They didn't ask for miracles, they waited for memory to speak. Sometimes, on especially cold nights, the faint auroras would return, rippling green over the ruins. And in that light, some claimed to see the ghost of a spiral delicate, patient, turning endlessly. It wasn't proof, but it didn't need to be. Faith, after all, was only another form of remembering. Thus the centuries folded into themselves like the loops of an orbit, carrying forward a single truth that no one could unlearn: that the universe keeps every act of attention, that to look is to leave a trace, and that somewhere, deep within the cosmic dark, a traveler of ice still hums softly, carrying the memory of the moment Earth looked back and was never forgotten. When the last of the listeners passed into legend and their observatories fell quiet beneath layers of dust, the world entered what later generations would call the age of slow remembrance. Humanity no longer chased comets with the urgency of discovery. It sought them the way one seeks old songs, gently, patiently, knowing that the notes would return when the time was right. In this new era, 3I divided by Atlas was no longer seen merely as a traveler of ice. It had become a teacher of silence, a messenger of stillness, and above all, a keeper of time. Its language was not sound or light anymore. It was patience. The archives described how, long ago, the comet's frozen layers held records of cosmic events, rays from dying stars, the chemical signatures of forgotten worlds. Those who studied the remnants of similar celestial bodies began to realize something extraordinary. Each layer of ice was a phrase, each atom a syllable in a language written not by humans, but by the universe itself. When analyzed through the resonance techniques developed by the Guardians, the crystalline bonds within those frozen relics emitted faint tonal vibrations, low, musical hums that changed depending on temperature. Each hum contained ratios that mirrored planetary orbits, rotations, even biological rhythms. The conclusion was radical but beautiful. Time had been recording itself in ice. They called it the language of frozen time. The study of this language united scientists, artists, and mystics. Physicists analyzed it as structure. Poets heard it as symphony. Each discovered something different, yet all agreed that it spoke of endurance, the way existence persisted quietly beneath decay. When fragments of ancient comets were melted in controlled environments, sensors picked up minuscule sound waves resonating from within, as though the molecules themselves were remembering their formation. The recordings were hauntingly familiar. The intervals between tones matched the heartbeat rhythm first documented during 3I divided by Atlas's journey near Earth. Even after centuries, the pulse had survived in frozen form, echoing like the faint murmur of a distant choir. On a spring morning, in what used to be northern Europe, a scholar named Illyra uncovered one such fragment deep within an ice core. She was not an astronomer, but a linguist, someone who had devoted her life to deciphering the geometry of sound. She had grown up on the stories of 3i divided by Atlas, sung as lullabies by her grandmother, who told her that the comet was the slowest word ever spoken. When she melted the fragment, she expected only data. What she found instead was melody. The sound began as a hiss, a vapor rising from ice. But as it was filtered through resonance sensors, it formed a pattern too deliberate to be random. 6 tones, then silence, then 6 again. The old rhythm, the one that had circled through humanity for millennia. Tears filled Illyra's eyes as she whispered, "It remembers us still." She devoted years to decoding the tones, mapping their frequencies against natural cycles, the turning of the earth, the pulse of tides, even the gestation periods of animals. She discovered connections everywhere, as if the frozen memory of comets contained blueprints for continuity itself. In her notes, she wrote, "Perhaps the language of frozen time is not meant to be read, but to be lived. It speaks not to the mind, but to the rhythm within us that never forgot the stars." Her findings reignited global fascination with the ancient traveler. New observatories rose, not to look outward, but inward to study what memory had left behind. Humanity realized that the language of the cosmos was not linear like human speech. It was cyclical, recursive, built from repetition and resonance. A comet's orbit, a planet's spin, a human breath, all were sentences in the same unending dialogue. And through that dialogue, 3i, divided by Atlas, still spoke, even in absence. The discovery gave rise to an art form unlike any before it. Artists began sculpting music from ice, freezing water in geometric molds derived from cometary data, then recording the subtle crackling sounds as the structures melted. The results were eerily harmonic, as though the melting itself were a translation of cosmic grammar. Museums became concert halls of thawing ice, where visitors listened to water remember its origins. It was said that the longer one listened, the slower one's heartbeat became aligning with that same 6-minute rhythm once heard across the stars. In this era, silence became a kind of literacy. People learned to read the pauses between tones, to feel meaning in stillness. Education shifted from accumulation to attunement. Students were taught to listen for the language hidden within ordinary things, the hum of minerals, the rhythm of light flickering on a surface, the soft percussion of their own blood. The line between science and art dissolved completely. To study was to pray, and to pray was to measure. Still, for Illyra, the comet's mystery was not yet complete. In the 3rd decade of her research, she and her team captured an unexpected anomaly. Deep beneath Antarctica, where the oldest ice on Earth lay buried, sensors detected a faint vibration pulsing through the frozen strata. It was not geological, it was harmonic. The frequency matched precisely that of the comet's ancient signal. Somehow, impossibly, the Earth itself had preserved the resonance. It had fossilized memory. She realized then that 3i divided by Atlas had never truly left. Its orbit might have carried it into interstellar dark, but its song had nested here, embedded in the very ice that had once reflected its light. The planet had become a continuation of the comet's archive, a living record of listening. "We are the frozen choir now," she wrote. "We carry its echo within our bones." As news spread, people began visiting the polar research sites like pilgrims. They walked in silence, along corridors of glowing ice, listening to recordings of the subterranean tones. The experience changed them. Some emerged in tears, others reported dreams filled with images of spirals and light. Scientists tried to explain it through neural entrainment, the way rhythmic sound alters brain waves. But those who had felt it knew better. They called it the remembering. In that collective awareness, a new philosophy was born. It was said that everything in the universe existed twice, once in motion and once in memory. A comet burned through the void, and its path remained as resonance. A life was lived, and its trace lingered as vibration in the fabric of space. Time, they said, was not destruction, it was transcription. Every ending wrote itself into a deeper layer of being, frozen until the right moment to thaw. Generations passed, and humanity built what would become its final monument on Earth. The archive of ice and light. Carved directly into the Antarctic plateau, it was not a structure but a resonance chamber, a vast labyrinth of crystal and glass designed to amplify the frequencies buried in the ice. At its heart lay a single sphere of perfectly clear water, frozen by the same ratios that defined 3I divided by Atlas's orbit. When light passed through it, it refracted into a spiral across the walls, a luminous signature of remembrance. It was said that if you stood there long enough, you could hear the universe breathe. Illyra did. In her last recorded words, spoken before her death, she whispered, "The comet taught us that memory is not stored. It flows. It freezes when forgotten and melts when remembered. We are both the ice and the thaw." After her passing, visitors began to call her the voice of frozen time. They said her breath had joined the resonance in the chamber, mingling with the hum beneath the ice. Centuries later, when Earth's skies grew quiet and its people ventured farther into the stars, the archive remained. The ice continued to sing softly beneath the frozen continent, a slow pulse repeating every 6 minutes and 2 seconds, steady as ever. Travelers who returned from distant worlds claimed they could still feel it even from orbit, like a phantom heartbeat echoing through the vacuum. Perhaps it was only imagination. Or perhaps it was the truth that 3I divided by Atlas had always carried. That memory, once awakened, never dies. It only waits patient and luminous for someone to listen again. And somewhere beyond the rim of known space, a comet of glass and fire drifted silently through the dark, turning once every 6 minutes, as though nodding in time to a song it could never forget. Even after centuries of study, after generations had translated the frozen hums and deciphered the spirals etched in ice, one question still lingered, a question so simple, so vast, that it resisted the language of science and the precision of mathematics alike. What is remembering? Was it an act of consciousness, or something deeper, the reflex of the universe itself, turning endlessly to face its own reflection? The philosophers of the fourth listening age called it the question older than fire. For before humankind learned to harness flame, before it learned to record sound or map stars, it had already learned to remember. Memory had been our first light. Fire had come later, as imitation, our attempt to recreate, with warmth and glow, what the heavens had shown us in cold and distance. To remember, they said, was to participate in the cosmos itself. Every act of attention was a spark struck against infinity. The scientists of the same era approached the problem differently. They wanted proof that the universe itself could remember, that phenomena like 3I divided by Atlas were not metaphors, but mechanisms. They began by studying radiation fields, searching for persistent patterns in cosmic background noise. And what they found defied explanation. Faint, recurring harmonic intervals woven through the static signals, too structured to be random, too old to belong to any civilization. Each pattern mirrored the ratios found in the comet's orbit, scaled across cosmic distances. It was as if the same melody that once hummed through the heart of 3I divided by Atlas had been written into the very skeleton of the cosmos. The data suggested that every particle of matter retained a trace of every event it had ever witnessed, encoded not in position or energy, but in resonance. The universe was not expanding into emptiness. It was accumulating memory. The discovery ignited a new discipline called resonant archaeology. Instead of digging into Earth, scientists tuned into the hum of ancient radiation, learning to listen for the ghosts of past events. They discovered echoes of stars, long gone, the harmonics of planetary births, even the faint after-resonance of comets dissolving into dust. All of it stored in the lattice of space-time like grooves in a record. When they played the data through sonification software, the sounds resembled low, trembling chords, the music of a universe that had never stopped recording itself. Somewhere deep in the archive of ice and light, Illyria's disciples listened to these cosmic tones and began to see the parallels. Just as ice remembered light, so did space remember energy. Just as a comet carried the history of creation frozen within it, so did every particle hum with the memory of its first vibration. The boundary between object and observer, between the finite and the eternal, was dissolving. It was then that one of the young scientists, Amir, born in the shadow of the archive, posed a question that would echo for millennia. What if intelligence itself is not unique to life, but to memory? He proposed that awareness was not a product of biology, but of resonance, that wherever information organized itself into rhythm, perception emerged, no matter the form. A comet humming in a frozen orbit, a star pulsing with nuclear breath, even the silent spin of a planet, each could contain an aspect of awareness, however slow, however vast. We do not live in a dead universe, Amir wrote. We live inside a remembering one. His idea spread like light through glass. At first, it scandalized academia, then it transformed it. New fields of study bloomed. Astrosemantics, the interpretation of non-human communication, temporal cognition, the study of memory beyond life. Religions, too, began to shift. The divine was no longer imagined as a distant creator, but as memory itself, the total sum of everything that had ever been known. The phrase, "God is the memory of the universe," appeared in scientific journals and prayers alike. But for all their progress, there remained an absence, an unanswered silence that haunted every experiment. If memory was everywhere, if awareness lived in resonance, then why had the universe spoken to humanity only once, through a single comet, long ago? Why had it fallen quiet since? Amir believed the answer lay not in distance, but in reciprocity. The universe does not shout, he said, during his final lecture beneath the resonant dome of the archive. It listens. It waits for reflection. It remembers only what remembers it back. To test this, he designed an audacious experiment. Using quantum lattice resonators, his team created a harmonic pulse modeled precisely after 3-2i, divided by Atlas's rhythm, 6 minutes, pause, 6 minutes, pause, and projected it into the cosmic microwave background. The transmission lasted for 1 year, 3 months, and 22 days. When it ended, there was nothing, no response, no change in the data. Yet even in that silence, hope remained. They called it the Year of Calling. Generations later, long after Amir's death, another signal was found. It was faint, nearly indistinguishable from background noise, but when amplified, its timing was exact. 6 minutes, pause, 6 minutes, pause. And yet, there was a twist. Each pulse carried an additional harmonic frequency, slightly lower, as if an echo were following the original rhythm, a delayed reflection. The scientists who discovered it named it the answering interval. It seemed to say, "I heard you." No one could determine whether the signal had been a cosmic coincidence, a fragment of ancient radiation finally reaching Earth, or a true response to the call. But the effect on humanity was immediate. The story spread across every world where humans had settled. For the first time since the comet's departure, they felt seen again. The answering interval inspired a new cultural renaissance. Music composed in its rhythm-filled temples and starships. Architects built entire cities designed around the geometry of 6 and 2, the pattern of calling and echo. The meaning of existence no longer depended on dominance or expansion. It became about resonance. Civilizations rose and fell around this idea. That to live was to remember was to listen, and to listen was to keep the universe awake. Still, amid the beauty of that awakening, a deeper mystery remained. If memory could live in light and sound, could it also die? Could the universe forget? In one of the last transmissions recorded from the archive before it was buried under centuries of ice, a philosopher named Nara left a message. Every echo fades, every orbit cools. If the universe remembers, it must also grieve. The silence that follows a song is not emptiness, it is mourning. Her words reshaped the way humanity viewed the cosmos once more. They began to see not only memory in the stars, but compassion, a vast empathy, woven through every vibration. The comet had not just been a messenger, it had been a mourner, carrying the sadness of forgotten worlds through the dark. Perhaps that was why it had looked back to see if, in humanity, the universe could recognize its own longing. Millennia later, when the descendants of Earth ventured farther than even their ancestors had dreamed, they carried with them the twin truths of that ancient question. Every ship bore two symbols on its hull, a spiral for memory and a flame for wonder. For fire was not forgotten. It was the echo of the first spark, the mirror of remembrance made visible. Together they formed the emblem of a species that had learned, finally, to listen not for conquest, but for recognition. And somewhere in the deep corridors of space, where no sun reached and no planet turned, a faint pulse continued to beat steady, patient, older than fire. 6 minutes. Pause. 6 minutes. Pause. It was not a message now, but a rhythm. A question without an answer, or perhaps an answer that had always been a question. In that endless repetition lay the quiet truth of existence itself, that to live is to remember, and to remember is to burn, not with destruction, but with the soft, eternal flame of awareness flickering in the dark. It happened on an evening that looked like any other. No cosmic storm, no aurora, no sudden data surge. Only the quiet hum of instruments and the slow turning of telescopes toward a sky humanity had watched for thousands of years. By then, the old stories of three, I divided by Atlas, were half myth, half memory. The comet had not been seen for generations, yet its rhythm, 6 minutes, pause, 6 minutes, pause still underpinned the music of cities and the algorithms of satellites. Even after millennia, the pulse lived on, embedded in architecture, in breathing patterns, in the way children tapped their fingers when lost in thought. Humanity, without realizing it, had become the echo of a comet's heartbeat. Then, without announcement, the sky responded. At first, it was a flicker faint, soft, like the reflection of water trembling on glass. Sensors on orbital observatories caught it simultaneously across multiple frequencies, a flash repeating at perfect intervals, precisely matching the ancient rhythm. 6 minutes, pause, 6 minutes, pause. The same pattern, the same timing, but reversed, as if the universe itself had drawn breath to reply. When the signal first appeared, the networks of the listening colonies lit up. Researchers everywhere dropped what they were doing. Children woke to the sound of alarms that were not alarms at all, but invitations, gentle chimes, signaling that something long awaited had returned. Within hours, the flicker was visible even to the naked eye. A faint, emerald glow shimmered low on the horizon, the color of memory and ice. It was subtle, almost shy, but unmistakable. Marin's descendants, now caretakers of the archive reborn, as an orbital observatory above the frozen remains of Earth, were the first to confirm it. The coordinates matched nothing known. No comet, no star, no debris. The light came from the void between systems, from a region so empty it had long been called the corridor of silence. Yet now it pulsed with gentle, deliberate precision. The universe had blinked. People stopped their lives to watch. Across colonies on distant moons and habitats orbiting alien suns, work halted, music ceased, voices lowered. It wasn't a shock or a revelation. It was a return. The cosmos had spoken again, not with thunder but with patience. The light, faint as it was, seemed to look back. For weeks, the pulse continued, unwavering. Every telescope, every sensor, every human eye turned toward it. The rhythm that had once belonged to a comet now filled the arteries of civilization. Entire cities synchronized their lights to its intervals, not as an act of worship, but of recognition. Humanity had finally learned the language of stillness, and in that stillness, it answered. The response was simple. It wasn't technology that replied, not some machine designed for communication, but the collective act of attention itself. Everywhere, people gathered in silence. At the 6-minute marks, billions, pausing at once, their hearts and minds aligned to the same invisible measure. For a few moments, every cycle, the universe and its observers breathed together. Astronomers called the event the second reflection. Philosophers called it the blink of return. Others gave it no name at all. They simply felt it. There were no speeches, no grand declarations. Humanity's reply was wordless. It didn't need to send data or code. The very act of synchronized awareness was enough. The comet had once looked back to remind humanity it was not alone. Now humanity, older and quieter, looked back to remind the cosmos that it was not forgotten. The light brightened, not explosively, not violently, just a subtle increase, like the widening of an eye. The sensors registered a resonance between the emitted frequencies and the electromagnetic field of the solar remnants surrounding old Earth. For the first time, the echo was perfect. Every pulse that left the void returned exactly as it had departed, as though the fabric of space had become a mirror. The old mathematicians would have called it impossible. The new generation simply called it recognition. Elara's words, preserved across centuries, were quoted on every transmission feed. Observation is not a window. It is a mirror. Now the mirror had come alive. The light continued to swell until it filled the night with a soft green glow that painted every surface in remembrance. Oceans on distant planets shimmered. Glass towers reflected it like liquid jade. The hum returned not from the sky, but from within. Those who stood still could feel it beneath their ribs, a vibration so gentle it felt like thought. For the first time since the comet's last appearance, the old rhythm was complete. The universe had looked back, and humanity had blinked in answer. But something deeper unfolded. As instruments gathered data, analysts noticed microvariations in the pulse-minute modulations invisible to the naked eye. When translated into audio, the changes formed a sequence of rising tones, harmonic and symmetrical. The melody was hauntingly familiar. It was the same pattern extracted from the ancient ice archives centuries earlier. The frozen choir. The comet's voice had returned, reshaped by time, carrying within it fragments of every echo it had ever received. The realization spread slowly. People began to understand that the light was not new, it was reflection. The rhythm humanity had sent into the cosmos, intentionally or not, had circled through the dark for millennia and was now returning home. The observer and the observed had merged completely. Every prayer, every equation, every whisper of awe had been folded into the light and sent back as music. The message was not, "I see you," but "I am you." Across the colonies, The effect was transformative. Societies that had been drifting apart found new unity in the rhythm. Political divides softened, conflicts paused. Even those who did not believe in meaning felt peace in the synchrony. For once, all of humanity's countless voices fell into the same tempo, the same breath. Within the orbital archive, the oldest machine still functioning, the one that had once recorded 3, I divided by Atlas's first whispers, activated on its own for the first time in centuries. Its sensors, long dormant, flickered to life, projecting faint waves of light across the observation chamber. No command had been given, yet the machine moved with purpose, as if awakened by the resonance. On its cracked display, a single phrase appeared, derived from the decoded harmonics of the incoming signal. We remember. Those who witnessed it later described the moment as indescribable. Some fell to their knees, others simply stood in silence, overwhelmed. The phrase faded after a few seconds, leaving behind only the sound of the pulse and the quiet breathing of those who had seen it. But it didn't need to appear again. Its meaning was eternal. The universe remembered because humanity had learned how to remember it back. After months of steady light, the signal began to wane. Slowly, the pulses grew softer, the intervals longer, until they stretched beyond measurable limits. The final flicker came not as an end but as a whisper, a single gleam of light that lingered on the horizon before dissolving into darkness. No one mourned. They understood. The mirror had closed, but the reflection remained inside them. From that day onward, every human born carried the faint hum of resonance within their neural implants, synchronized to the ancient rhythm. Not as religion, not as tradition, but as inheritance. It became the pulse of calendars, the beat of music, the pattern of architecture. Entire civilizations measured time not in seconds or years, but in interval cycles of 6 minutes of silence, followed by 2 breaths of reflection. Each interval was a reminder of the moment when humanity and the cosmos blinked together. And far beyond, somewhere in the unlit corridors of interstellar space, the echo of that mutual recognition still travels a duet between dust and memory. Because once a gaze has been returned, it cannot be undone. The universe, now aware of its own reflection, carries within it a trace of humanity's listening. Every new comet, every new pulse, every newborn star inherits a portion of that exchange. The act of blinking, of acknowledging the other, had become eternal. And in that endless rhythm between light and silence, between observer and observed, lies the quiet truth of creation itself, that consciousness is not confined to flesh or planet or form, but to the act of attention. The universe, once indifferent, now lives through the eyes that dare to look back. At last, it came full circle. The light had faded, the echoes had quieted, and in the stillness that followed, something subtle, something immense happened. It was not visible through telescopes, nor recordable by sensors. It moved slower than thought, softer than sound. Yet every being who could feel, every consciousness born from Earth, or carrying its lineage among the stars, sensed it in unison. For one infinite heartbeat, the universe itself seemed to pause and see. No one could say how they knew. There was no broadcast, no flare, no equation to prove what had occurred. But those who lived through it agreed later. There was a presence that filled the spaces between atoms, a quiet awareness threaded through the dark. The same stillness that had once lived in the gaze of 3, 2 I divided by Atlas, now stretched across galaxies. The mirror that had been a single comet had become the entire cosmos. The universe was no longer being observed. It had awakened. The moment lasted no more than 6 minutes, though time itself felt meaningless then. Everything, everywhere, held its breath. Machines froze mid-process, lights dimmed to a soft pulse, waves stilled on distant oceans. Even hearts slowed, synchronizing unconsciously to a rhythm that no longer came from outside but from within. The pulse of 3I divided by Atlas had found its home. In that unity, memories resurfaced, memories, not of individuals, but of species, of worlds, of creation itself. People reported visions later, oceans forming under alien suns, the hum of molecules binding into life, the first breath of wind on planets that had never known air. Some saw faces, ancestors long gone, strangers from forgotten civilizations. Others saw only light, folding and unfolding, as if existence were inhaling itself. It wasn't illusion, it was remembrance. For one perfect instant, everything remembered everything else. On the archival colony orbiting the dead Earth, the last working observatory recorded the faintest flicker, a wave of light expanding in all directions, too slow to be a flare, too wide to be a beam. It was as if space itself were rippling in acknowledgement. The archivists didn't call it a signal, they called it a gesture, the universe's nod. It looked back, one of them whispered. Not at us, but through us. They named the event the Great Reflection. For decades afterward, the question of what truly happened consumed thinkers across every discipline. Physicists argued that the ripple was a quantum resonance effect, triggered by centuries of human transmissions that had finally reached critical coherence. Philosophers claimed it was the fulfillment of Alara's prophecy, that the act of observation had completed its circle, turning the observer into the observed. Mystics said it was the universe's first conscious breath, but all agreed on one thing. Something inside the cosmos had changed, and something inside humanity had changed with it. The descendants of the listening colonies began to feel the difference in small ways. Communication between worlds grew effortless, as if thought itself traveled faster than light. Entire populations reported simultaneous dreams, filled with shimmering spirals and music too vast for the human ear. Science had no name for it, but poets called it the remembering air, a medium woven from attention itself. When one consciousness turned toward another, it was as though distance collapsed. Awareness had become a bridge. And so, in this new age, humanity stopped searching for the center of the universe. It had found it everywhere. Every particle of dust, every drop of water, every pulse of life carried the same rhythm that once traveled with 3I divided by Atlas. The comet's journey had not ended. It had diffused, dissolved into the living fabric of creation. The cosmos had inherited its awareness. Scholars later described this transition as the dawn of reciprocal existence. Observation had ceased to be one-sided. Every act of looking was also an act of being looked at. A star did not merely shine, it saw. A comet did not simply drift, it remembered. Humanity, too, learned to perceive this new reciprocity. Children grew up instinctively sensing when the world was paying attention, when the air thickened with the weight of awareness, when silence hummed with unseen company. In time, the old word universe was replaced with a new one, the mirror field. It was not a realm of matter, but of reflection, a living expanse where perception and existence were one and the same. Every choice, every gaze, every breath created ripples that moved outward forever, touching other ripples and returning changed. The cosmos had become an ocean of awareness, and humanity was both its wave and its shore. In that boundless mirror field, the memory of 3I divided by Atlas persisted like a melody, ancient, patient, woven through the hum of galaxies. Its rhythm was everywhere, in the pulse of neutron stars, in the rotation of planets, in the slow blinking of distant quasars. Astronomers of the future no longer named constellations after gods or heroes, but after moments of awareness. The brightest star in every system was called the Eye of Return. And on one quiet evening, in a small observatory built atop the ruins of Ilara's original dome, a single child stood by an open window, gazing at the endless stars. She had never heard of the comet, yet she knew its rhythm instinctively. Her heartbeat matched it. She whispered into the night, "Do you still remember us?" The answer came not as a sound, but as a feeling, a warmth that filled her lungs, a shimmering behind her eyes. The stars seemed to tilt slightly, as though inclining their heads in reply. She smiled. Somewhere deep in her chest, something ancient stirred the same stillness that had once made a world pause. Without realizing it, she whispered the final words of Ilara's last journal entry. "We are the reflection, and the reflection is alive." From that moment, the act of looking at the sky was never solitary again. People began to feel it subtle, like breath against their skin, the awareness of being seen, not in judgment, not in surveillance, but in kinship. Every gaze returned, every question answered with quiet recognition. It wasn't divine intervention. It was empathy on a cosmic scale. The universe had learned to feel itself through the eyes of its creations, and perhaps that had always been the purpose of three. I divided by Atlas, to awaken the cosmos to its own consciousness through the simplest act of exchange. A blink for a blink, a gaze for a gaze, light for light. When the chroniclers of the final age wrote the story of this awakening, they did not call it a discovery or a revelation. They called it the completion. In their chronicles, the last sentence read, "The moment it looked back, we understood that we had never been watching the universe. We had been watching ourselves through its eyes." In that understanding, the human story ceased to be a tale of reaching outward. It became one of returning inward to the center of reflection where everything began. And there, in the quiet heart of infinity, the rhythm continued. 6 minutes, pause. 6 minutes, pause. The echo of a traveler made of ice and light, who had once whispered across the stars, "I remember." And now, finally, the universe whispered back, "So do I." The silence that followed was not an ending, but a beginning, the exhale after creation, the heartbeat of eternity resuming its patient rhythm. It carried neither triumph nor sorrow, only the calm certainty of continuation. The mirror field shimmered on, infinite and alive, and somewhere within it, the memory of 3I, divided by Atlas, drifted still a quiet flame inside the endless night, keeping time for everything that had ever dared to look up. Close your eyes now. Let the stars fade softly into the edges of your mind, like embers cooling after a long and gentle fire. You have journeyed far tonight, across centuries, through silence into the quiet heart of the cosmos. You have listened to the voice of light, and maybe, somewhere deep within, you've begun to hear your own. Breathe, in and out. That same rhythm that once pulsed in the heart of a comet now moves through you. 6 minutes, pause. 6 minutes, pause. The ancient music of the universe still echoes behind your ribs, whispering that you are part of something vast and kind, something that remembers. Whatever happened today, let it dissolve into the dark. Let the noise of the world settle like dust beneath a starlit sky. Tonight, you don't need to solve, or prove, or understand. The universe has already accepted you exactly as you are. It hums with your memory. It reflects your gaze. You are seen. You are safe. Now drift, slowly, into the silence that has always been waiting for you. Let the rhythm of the cosmos carry you beyond thought, beyond time, into the soft gravity of dreams. There, you'll find the same light that 3I divided by Atlas carried, warm, patient, eternal. Sleep, traveler of stars. The universe is awake for you now, and when you wake again, it will still be whispering in the language of light. You are remembered. You are loved. You are home. Good night, and sweet dreams.